Thank you very much. Honorable Minister Barbara Creasy, Her Excellency Mrs. Domba Sibanda, the Deputy Ambassador of the Republic of Zimbabwe, representing His Excellency Mr. David Hamadzipiri, the Ambassador who could not be with us today, our Nedbank Board Chairperson, Mr. Mpho Makwana, the NBF Chairperson, Mr. Geoff Rothschild, our Nedbank CEO, Mr. Mike Brown, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Amos Hadebe, and I'm the Executive Head for Group Stakeholder Relations and Public Affairs at Nedbank. It is a great honor to kickstart today's proceedings, and it is wonderful to see you all in person because the last event that we had was on a virtual platform. For those who are joining us for the first time today, this event of which we call it the Nedbank-NBF Networking Forum. It is a private sector-led initiative that provides a platform for senior government leaders and business executives to deliberate on topical issues that impact the growth and development of Africa. The theme of today's session, which is Greening SADC towards Vision 2030, coordinating public and private sector collaboration to accelerate SADC's 2030 Just Transition Strategy, is a very important theme. It is important not only because it has been suggested by our chairperson, Mr. Mpho Makwana. It is important because climate change and just transition are issues that impact our region, the SADC region. They impact our continent, Africa. They impact the whole world. They impact future generations. And I dare say, if not managed carefully, they could impact the future of mankind. The objective of today's session is to promote the understanding of green economy and facilitate its adaptation in SADC. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, these sessions are not talk shops. We always have an expected outcome, out of which then we develop a strategy and a program that takes into consideration the recommendations that would have been made, and then we implement them. So the expected outcome of today's session is to develop a roadmap of how Africa can achieve net zero transmission from a regional and industry perspective. We also seek input from both the private sector and from government to make sure that we accelerate SADC's just transition. We are also pleased that this session is in partnership with the National School of Government under the leadership of Professor Busani Ngawin. This partnership with the NBF has been running since 2011. So we've been running strong for the past 11 years, and we look forward to the next 11 years, and the platform is sponsored by Nedbank. We've got exciting topics that will be unpacked by our esteemed speakers and panelists today. And the topics that will be discussed today are as follows. We will look at a government perspective on what is the role of government in green economy or net zero roadmap by 2050. We will then have, for the first time, an academic perspective that will look at just transition and climate change in Africa. What is the status quo leading towards 2050? We will then have one of the important topics, which is the financing of just transition. And we'll have colleagues from Nedbank and from the DBSA having an interesting conversation. We will then have a business perspective whereby senior executives from Sasol, from Siemens Energy, and from Anglo American will be giving us a perspective on what are some of the businesses doing to achieve net zero and what support, if any, they need from government. Then we'll have my colleague and partner from the NBF, the CEO, Peter van Dal, who will then unpack the SADC Just Transition Strategy. Then we'll have Professor Busani Ngaweni, who will arrive a little bit later because he's got an engagement at the Wits Business School as a respondent on what would have been discussed today. We'll then have a wrap-up and way forward and closure. Then that will be followed by Geoff Rothschild from the NBF will give us a vote of thanks. At the end of the session, we invite you to join us in the foyer for a networking cocktail dinner. As I mentioned, I'm not alone. I'm with my colleague and partner, Peter Vandel from the NBF, who will take or rather, who will facilitate the latter part of the program. Our facilitator or moderator today is Dr. Martin Davis, the MD of Africa and Emerging Markets at Deloitte, of which I will hand over to shortly. But before doing that, I'd like to call upon our Nedbank CEO, Mr. Mike Brown, to give us a welcome address. Thank you very much and enjoy the session.
Right, thanks very much, Amos, and good afternoon, everybody, in particular, Honourable Minister Creasy, Her Excellency Mrs. Donga Sibanda, the Deputy Ambassador from Zimbabwe, Mpho Makwana, our Nedbank Board Chairman, and Geoff, it's also always great to see you. You and I seem to bump into each other in many, many of these events. So just on behalf of the Nedbank Group, it really is great to see people in 3D again and be able to welcome you all to this forum, as well as Microsoft Teams and Zoom do work. There's nothing quite like seeing people in person, particularly when you want to have some form of networking forum. And I'm certainly looking forward to listening on a topic that is, as I'm sure you all know, very close to our heart as the Green Bank, not only in our color, but in the credentials that I think Nedbank has shown over many, many years. So on exactly this day in 2009, the Third World Meteorological Organization convened the World Climate Conference held in Geneva. And that conference in many ways, I think, was viewed as both a beginning and an end. And I guess if you start at the end, it represented the culmination of 30 years of progress on climate research, monitoring, applications, and impact assessments under the World Climate Programme that was established in the wake of the first World Climate Conference in 1979 and underpinned and refocused during the second World Climate Conference that took place in 1990. But it also marked the beginning of a new and more integrated approach to the application of climate science to societal needs through the establishment of a new global framework for climate services, which would focus powerful new scientific and data-driven capabilities on the formidable social, economic, and environmental challenges of living with a large natural variability in climate and how that should be mitigated and adapted to. So if we sort of fast forward to today, what we all know for sure is that climate change and the impacts of climate change on our world has become a crisis. And without wanting to be overly alarmist, we know that there are numerous imminent dangers to our lives and livelihoods, despite best efforts by many, but certainly not all, to reduce those risks. And I guess all you had to do, I'm sure many of you watched your TVs last night and watched the devastation of the floods in Pakistan and the extraordinary challenges that has presented to millions and millions of people. And closer to home, we know the challenges in KwaZulu-Natal as a consequence of the flooding that we saw there. So while we do know that climate change is a global challenge, it also requires local solutions. And that's exactly where collaboration between government, private sector, multilateral institutions, civil societies is vital as we work out how to transition away from our reliance on fossil fuels and the impact that that creates on the most vulnerable in society as a consequence of its impact on climate change, and how to shift to more environmentally friendly sources of energy. The UN's IPCC Comprehensive Summary of Global Climate Science sets out the consequences of climate breakdown worldwide, looking at floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, all impacting on lives and livelihoods, food and water supplies, as well as infrastructure. And as global temperatures have risen, the effect of extreme weather becomes much more apparent, stalling many of the efforts that we've seen to make our infrastructure and communities more resilient to that. And facing, we know that on top of all of that, so many governments, countries, and societies around the world dramatically shifted focus to the challenges of COVID-19, and rightly so more recently. But that certainly would have been a distraction from the other, but perhaps longer-term challenge in front of us from climate-related matters. And I think what we see across the African continent is governments forced to spend millions and billions of dollars coping with the impacts of climate on societies, and in so doing, diverting funds away from very, very needed areas that we all know about in terms of either infrastructure, education, and health, and further threatening to drive countries into poverty. And it's estimated within that context that African countries over time will have to spend, I guess, on an annualized basis, around about 4% of GDP on mitigating the impact of climate change. And we know from research that children, the vulnerable, and the youth in particular bear the brunt of this impact. And children in developing countries are 10 times more likely to die before the age of 5 than children in developed countries, primarily due to aspects like malnutrition, which are in many ways a result of household food security challenges as a consequence of the impact of climate change on harvests and food. We've certainly seen in our region the impacts of prolonged droughts and unseasonably high rainfall, in particular in Mozambique and in South Africa, and the resultant damage to infrastructure and unfortunate massive loss of life. I think, as the SADC Secretariat has noted, while the region is making encouraging progress to address the impact of climate change, sustainable development of the region continues to be hampered by land degradation, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, pollution, inadequate access to clean water and sanitation, and poor urban conditions and urban development and urban planning that themselves worsen poverty, unemployment, and access to basic services. So I think it's just, therefore, a matter of urgency that a just transition is addressed to both take cognizance of the many opportunities to achieve the social development objectives in SADC countries alongside the environmental objectives that we hope to achieve. And certainly we believe that a just transition does have the potential to be a new and sustainable engine of growth in lower and middle income, and indeed many higher income economies, and can be a net generator of decent green jobs, as well as contribute significantly to poverty eradication and social inclusion. But like most things in life, it won't just happen. It needs a plan. And we know that the SADC region has adopted the Regional Green Economy Strategy and Action Plan for Sustainable Development, which is a blueprint for member countries to catalyze the socio-economic transformation of the region towards a more resource-efficient, environmentally sustainable, climate change resilient, and low carbon development path of a more equitable society. And core to this plan is to transition towards increased levels of sustainable economic development, which will ultimately improve the well-being of citizens in the SADC environment, as well as mitigate the future risks of climate change and exposures to environmental risks and ecological risks. So I think, it goes without saying for all of us that it is important that this just transition should be equitable, else it will just simply not succeed. It means shifting our environment from a more extractive economy to a regenerative economy that is fair and inclusive, and at the same time creates work opportunities that don't leave communities and people behind. So as we debate and decide on policy, regulation, financial interventions, etc., all of which can help catalyze this just transition, I think we always have to think and place the communities and the societies that we operate in at the heart of these discussions, so that we don't neglect or forget those people who might be far away from where we're having these discussions in Sandton, but are actually the most impacted by climate change, especially the unemployed, the poor, and people living with disabilities and the youth. We have to make sure that any just transition benefits them and enables communities to take advantage of new opportunities that will emerge from the green economy. And certainly we need to ensure that communities do not suffer from job losses or declining economic prosperity as a consequence. Otherwise, as I said earlier, I think we will simply fail. SADC certainly requires, to achieve a just transition, material capital mobilization. And, just to give you some sense of all of this, and there are lots of estimates, but the Presidential Climate Commission estimated that South Africa would require $250 billion over the next 3 years to transform the energy sector, over the next 3 decades, to transform the energy sector. And of that, around about 10 billion would be needed to be allocated towards climate justice outcomes, which will be needed to support workers and communities in that transition. And these are just absolutely staggering amounts of money. So it will clearly require coordinated capital raising efforts, including governments, multilateral organizations, as well as support from the financial community and banks such as Nedbank, because governments alone will certainly not be able to carry that financial burden, in particular because many governments looking to make this transition already have extraordinary stretched fiscal situations, in particular post the challenges of COVID. So global donor funding, private sector participation, etc., will be absolutely crucial. And to be able to maximize these contributions, the private sector certainly, I believe, will need to commit to the deliberate allocation of capital in steadily increasing amounts to match the scale and time and sensitivity of the societal environmental challenges that threaten to erode both long-term economic and environmental sustainability. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the decision that the finance sector needs to make today regarding capital allocation towards a just transition are vitally important to shape tomorrow's economy. And, granted that in that sense, tomorrow isn't really tomorrow. It's the future that many of us may not be around to see or benefit from. But as human beings, I certainly know we all have an extraordinary obligation to leave our children and our grandchildren with a better planet than the outlook for the planet currently points to. And, for Nedbank, as a purpose-driven and values-led bank, we've already taken what we think is a leading position in this capital mobilization and funding of green projects, guided by our energy policy, which we released in April of 2021, that commits us to net zero by 2045, on top of already being Africa's first carbon neutral bank. The Nedbank board has initially earmarked up to 50 billion rand for the financing of renewable energy, and I'm sure would be hugely supportive of increasing those limits as we begin to fill them up. We're already more than halfway there, and certainly we have very, very strong pipelines in embedded energy generation working alongside our clients who are also on this green energy journey. We also offer solutions to all of our clients across mining, commercial, industrial, and the agri sectors, focused on water, which we believe will be the next, if it is not already, the next big infrastructural requirement in South Africa. And then just, finally, we certainly feel at Nedbank we have over time in our CRB business under Anel Bosman, and you'll hear from her later, built a market-leading infrastructure finance team, and underneath that, a market-leading energy team, which has enabled us to be right at the forefront of all the rounds of renewable energy in South Africa, with a much higher than our normal market share participation in all of those, something that we are incredibly proud of, both in terms of the importance to the country, but also the importance to our brand as a green bank, guided by our purpose of using our financial expertise to do good for individuals, families, businesses, and society. So at Nedbank, we view a just transition as an economic, social, and moral imperative to which we are fully committed to play our part towards the attainment of a green and inclusive future of the SADC region, and as a result, a better life for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just got off a flight, so a bit slightly disorientated. Good afternoon, everybody. Mike, I recall you said something in the media about a year ago. I see you getting worried now, no need. This is a good thing. Just over a year ago, I think you returned from the Davos annual Jamboree. And you said in 2021 that the best economic policy at the time was a vaccination. If we fast forward now, where dare I use a phrase, post-COVID, what would the one-liner truism be for economic policy today? Dare I use the word decarbonization? An economy, a very carbon-intensive, emerging, developing economy that South Africa is, clearly the, again, accelerated post-COP26 in Glasgow last year, but the decarbonization agenda truly is one of the arguably very few tailwinds that we as an economy could benefit from if we are or were to accelerate the decarbonization agenda. A phrase that we hear so much of in South Africa, is so easy to say, has such deeper, often overly politicized interpretations, is structural reform. Structural reform, I often say, is a synonym for politically difficult to do reform, or reform that seeks to counter entrenched state vested interests. For me, I was horrified a few weeks ago when our finance minister spoke about a gross fixed capital formation figure of 13.4% of GDP. Now, everyone in this room will know, and this, Peter, is the NBF's sort of core mission and day job, is that the target as set by National Development Reform Plan in South Africa is 30%. Anything less than 20% is woeful underspend. The sweet spot is 25 to 30. Something I often say, I spent my formative years growing up, and I was a youngster, I still am, in Asia, where typically a 25 to 35% gross fixed capital formation spend, i.e. investment to GDP, was the norm, not for 1 or 2 years, but for a generation. And if a country can achieve that, investment into infrastructure for a generation, that already gives you arguably a 3.5% GDP return every year. Again, compound that over a generation. That has underpinned the Asian success story. It's not underpinning ours. So for me, I think there's 3 ingredients for successful countries, maybe companies as well, obviously. One is resources. The second is capital. There's plenty of that in this room. And thirdly, maybe intangibly and hard to define at times, is conviction. And I think we as South Africans often lack, for whatever reason, the conviction required to drive this very woeful, as I said, 13.4% to what is a very achievable, considering the resources we have, considering the capital we have in this country and beyond, through the likes of Nedbank, obviously, to drive this figure and really drive development in our country through, easier said than done, infrastructure spend. Just to add to Amos's great introduction, and you covered everything, Amos, thanks for that, saved me a job. I'm also an NED of NEPAD Business Foundation and supporting Geoff, Peter, and team to carry out the great work the NBF is doing. But never, ever has there been a more important time now, considering that extremely low investment in the infrastructure in our country, that the mission of the NBF is as important as it is now. It really is. We are looking for growth in this country. There's no easier lever to pull than investment into infrastructure, particularly in light of a decarbonization agenda that brings us all together today. From my side, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for the kind invitation, everybody. And I'd like to invite Mpho Makwana, who's the chairperson of Nedbank. Mpho, over to you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Honorable Minister Barbara Creecy, Your Excellency, Madam Donga Sibanda, Deputy Ambassador of the Republic of Zimbabwe. In absentia, we express condolences to His Excellency Vichio Ngiwete, who's the High Commissioner of the Republic of Namibia, to South Africa, who couldn't join us this afternoon due to bereavement in his family. My dear friend and colleague, our CEO, Mike Brown, the other set of friends that I've also known for many years, my dear friend, Geoff Rothschild, who's here as chair of the Nedbank Business Foundation. Dr. Martin Davis, on some occasions, is a partner in crime at the Mining Indaba Ministerial Symposium. Good to have you here as our moderator, Martin. He's managing director at emerging markets at Deloitte. Our various strategic partners, key stakeholders, academics, and panelists, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, once more, Dumelang, goeiemiddag, good afternoon. The opportunity to speak here, Geoff, is always gratifying for me because it takes me back to around 1999-2000, when I used to be managing director of the marketing communication agency, Saatchi & Saatchi. We were blessed, perhaps, to be awarded the contract then to design the logo, the first logo for NEPAD, to craft the marketing communication and go-to-market strategy for NEPAD. Ms. Taninga Shope then, today Ambassador Taninga Shope Lini, was the general manager responsible and Professor Wiseman Kuhlu was the chair at the time, based at the DBSA. It's really gratifying at the backdrop of these positive memories that I'm also able to participate this afternoon in this important dialogue. As Mike has already indicated, at Nedbank we're inspired by our purpose statement to apply our financial expertise to do good for individuals, families, businesses, and society. It is on this basis that we wish to spur other leaders in the public and private sectors within SADC and the broader African continent to rise to the challenge of dealing with the imminent challenge of climate emergency that confronts us as a people. The 16 Southern African SADC states have recorded 36% of all weather-related disasters in the past 4 decades. These have affected at least 177 million people, left 2.7 million people homeless, inflicted with damage, and also caused damage in excess of 14 billion US dollars. Climate change continues and will continue to increase the frequency, intensity, and duration and locations of these slow and sudden onset impacts. Angola is currently facing the worst drought emergency in the last 38 years as a result of climate change. Shortages of food, lack of potable water, cattle dying from disease, and malnourished children are amongst the heartbreaking consequences of climate change. Botswana is considered highly vulnerable to climate variability due to its high dependence on rain-fed agriculture and natural resources, with high levels of poverty, particularly in the rural communities, and a low adaptive capacity to deal with these sudden changes. Lesotho is already experiencing negative effects of climate change due to increased frequency of extreme events. Again, droughts, increased rates of soil erosion, in some parts, emerging trends of desertification and reduced soil fertility. Malawi has also experienced climate change. Climate change continues to be a challenge in terms of causing various devastating shocks that have increased in frequency, and in that country in terms of erratic rainfall, droughts, prolonged dry spells, and strong winds. In the 2021 Climate Change Risk Index, it is noted that Mozambique is the 5th most affected country by extreme weather in terms of global trends in the last 2 decades. Mozambique has experienced changing weather patterns linked to climate change that have triggered more intense floods and cyclones. Worse, the country is the 35th most vulnerable and the 24th least ready country, meaning that it is kind of doubly impacted upon by these climate change effects. The Kingdom of Eswatini is one of the African countries also deeply impacted. If one looks at Tanzania, average annual surface temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius since 1960, therefore causing a situation where warming sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean continue to also, in La Nina-like conditions, to lead to flooding, outbreaks of cholera, and destruction of crops and infrastructure. One can go through all the lists, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and various countries in SADC. These patterns just consistently demonstrate the challenges that we face. In our own country, in April of 2022, we also witnessed the intense rains, the floods that ravaged the communities of KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape, and sadly, more than 400 people lost their lives as a result. If one looks broadly at higher temperatures and the reductions in rainfall, one notes that various forecasts indicate that there's going to be a continuation of this pattern of really challenging weather patterns, culminating, causing tension and challenges in already depleted water resources. I wish to recommend to us to draw some inspiration from some of the African wisdom in environmental conservation that we can learn if we look firstly to draw wisdom from the baobab tree, also known as the Africa tree of life. It can live up to 1,000 years, can store up to 120,000 liters of water in its lifetime. And one wonders whether we are, as people placed in this continent, in this region, where we're endowed with baobabs, whether we're really investing enough in understanding those indigenous systems, in understanding what our forebears also would have learned from a tree such as the baobab in terms of resilience. And perhaps I would want to challenge us to look at ourselves, whether we are largely looking at ourselves outside in through the lens of Europeans, or we are able to also do inside out and learn from our own indigenous systems. We welcome policy interventions that SADC has established in the 3 main environmental policy goals that seek to foster sustainable development, and these are in the areas of protection and environment, in terms of health, environment and livelihoods, preservation of the natural heritage, biodiversity and the life-supporting ecosystems of Southern Africa. The third area is in the area of regional economic development towards ensuring an equitable and sustainable basis of the benefits of present and future generations. As Mike said, we have to think of our children and our children's children, and therefore we have to be those leaders that seek to plant trees under whose shades we're not going to sit. Just transition is top of mind on the agenda of every individual and corporate that has a keen interest in making our planet future-proof and better than, hopefully, leaving it better than we found it. The African continent also faces a double-edged sword to both catch up and also be future-proof. Therefore, just transition means we have to recognize that Africa is starting from a lower base, as I'm sure it's commonly known, in terms of our move towards a low-carbon economy, but that Africa, at the same time, because it still has to also do catch-up in terms of industrialization, we have to guard against making the most vulnerable in our societies to pay for the quantum leap towards a green, low-carbon economic platform. As we embark on the just transition journey, great innovation is required to ensure that we are both pro-development, pro-poor, such that a critical mass is achieved in terms of ensuring that we take a critical mass of people along into an environment that is low carbon but driven by sustainable livelihoods and constantly improving quality of life. An essential requirement to sustain Africa's industrialization is improving access to electricity and energy broadly. I think we talk a lot about electricity, but forget that the energy value proposition, the value chain, is broader than just electricity. We also need to be grateful for the abundance of sunshine that we have in the continent, treat it as an asset that can be leveraged, ensuring that given where we are in this continent, we're able to explore that proposition fully. Solar and many other forms of renewable energy can immensely enhance affordability and access to electricity and energy to many across SADC and the continent of Africa. Climate resilience finance is unequally distributed worldwide, and we know that often as the African continent, we're always on our back foot on this one. Africa received 26% of available financing between 2016 and 2019. 3/4 of that was in the form of loans and other non-grant instruments that must still be repaid later. Most has been directed towards cutting emissions in terms of mitigation strategies, with adaptation assigned only 21% of global climate funding in 2018. However, most opportunities are emerging for innovative financing. There's a need to have private sector investments as part of the solution, bringing in innovative financial mechanisms such as blended finance, green and blue bonds, debt swaps, which can be leveraged in terms of ensuring that the limited public resources to mobilize huge investments can be complemented. Providing sustainable finance solutions is a key imperative for us at Nedbank. Our specialized sector, corporate finance, capital markets, sustainable finance, and relationships work alongside our clients to finance transactions that progress the just transition that is required within our built environments, energy, transport, and food systems. Key products include project finance for green infrastructure, and we have also, as the board, various board committees that also provide oversight and also give input into these directional areas, from the committee that looks at ethics in terms of transformation, social ethics, right through to that which looks, we actually were the first bank to set up a climate resilience risk committee, which looks at some of these things in more detail. In 2021, Nedbank disbursed 3 billion rands to clients in the form of sustainability-linked loans that embedded sustainability performance criteria in the areas of reduction of carbon emissions, improvement of water quality, and I think Mike spoke at length on that, achievement of energy efficiencies, and local sourcing of goods. Bond transactions continued to dominate the sustainable finance market in 2021, including green bonds funding renewable energy, social bonds creating jobs, and sustainability bonds contributing to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Nedbank has been a pioneer in this field, and once again, by strategically raising use of proceeds green funds from the capital markets to on-lend into key green impact sectors such as renewable energy and green residential developments. To date, Nedbank has raised 6.8 billion rands in green bonds, with 2.1 billion raised during 2021. 910 million rands was raised through the issuance of the first green additional Tier 1 instrument in Africa from a commercial bank. The funding will be directed strategically to support the financing of new green renewable energy projects in South Africa. 125 million rands was raised through the issuance of a green housing bond. The proceeds raised will support additional mortgage finance, solutions for consumers buying into green certified developments. 1.09 billion rands was raised through the issuance of a green residential development bond. The solution is unique in that it leverages blend financing. The proceeds raised will finance EDGE certified green residential housing developments in South Africa, up to 75% of which are anticipated to be in the affordable housing segment. This instrument also represents a first of its kind. To maximize their contributions to sustainable development and achieve the outcomes required, financial institutions must commit to the deliberate allocation of capital in steadily increasing amounts that match the scale and the sensitivity of the societal and environmental challenges threatening to erode long-term economic and socio-political stability. In 2021, the finance sector started to realize a global shift where we saw global green bond issuances to date exceeding $1 trillion, of which $150 billion worth have been certified, and other sustainable financial instruments starting to scale as well. Many banks have committed publicly to new sustainable finance investment targeting, particularly targeting trillions of dollars towards finance mitigation and adaptation activities that will enable a just transition. Much of the African continent, including South Africa, is water constrained, and I think Mike spoke at length around some of the innovative solutions that we are considering in terms of contributing our fair share towards climate change mitigation. Nedbank believes that a programmatic approach to water and sanitation is required. Much like the successful RE-PP program, which has delivered excellent results in the energy sector, major sector players such as the DBSA, with input from South African commercial banks, have begun working on such approach in the water sector. Given that the investment deficit for South Africa's loan is estimated at over 30 billion rand per annum, the limited number of bankable projects in this sector remains a challenge, along with typically long lead times for the completion of transactions, as well as challenging governance issues in the sector. While we managed to land more projects and clients in the water sector in 2021 than in 2020, this combination of factors continues to hamper our delivery on our goals with regard to Sustainable Development Goal number 6. Through our corporate and investment banking and business banking divisions, we offer financial solutions to participants in the mining, commercial, industrial, and agricultural sectors to enable them to access safe and affordable potable water and adequate sanitation, to enhance water use efficiency through water recycling, treatment, harvesting, and reuse. There also has been a notable increase in interest in the funding solutions from commercial and industrial businesses that are becoming increasingly aware of the risks of water scarcity to their sustainability and the importance of water recycling, purification, and rainwater harvesting. Given the possibility that these loans can be repaid from the often significant savings on water utility bills, the offering minimizes the impact on business cash flows. At Nedbank, we recognize that there can be no authentic response to ESG priorities without a genuine commitment to be an effective catalytic agent for positive change. Being effective is possible only with a clearly defined purpose that acts as an organization's North Star. And Mike spoke earlier about us being not just a green bank by name only, but also by creed and DNA. And for us, that means using our financial expertise, as we said, to do good for all our key stakeholders. Together, the SDGs as forward-looking strategic levers and ESG as a backward-looking measure of sustainable financing activities keeps us on track to fulfilling our purpose consistently. Through our sustainable development finance commitments, we aim to become the model that finance institutions want to emulate to help address the world's environmental, social, and governance challenges. We know that a relentless focus on sustainable development finance, supported of course by philanthropy, is the most important lever we and all other banks have at our disposal to drive progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nedbank, through our investment bank, is the leading funder of renewable energy in South Africa, and I don't think I need to dwell on this. I think it's well known. But our participation in the program has also created opportunities for successful collaboration in our organization, which has created additional value for our clients. Today, Nedbank is at the forefront of renewable energy finance and is a leading funder of the RIPP in South Africa, funding diverse renewable energy projects that have added to the grid a total of 3,446 megawatts, as well ensuring that we're looking at a total to date of 6,422 megawatts added. The journey ahead as we make strides towards Vision 2030 is carved with steep hills and uncertainty. Therefore, it is imperative for SADC governments, businesses, and communities to collectively contribute towards greening the region for the sake of its future. It would be callous for us to let the, in the Limpopo area of the Botokwa, the bullfrog is a staple protein. And so in that sphere, their sense of having a meal that is a product of resilience is putting this bullfrog in a boiling 3-foot pot. And so when you watch that meal being prepared, it just makes you appreciate the big challenges of the global system being almost on a similar boiling pot process. Let me leave you with these words from an inspiration from the baobab tree. At the heart of the African plain stands a tree both old and sage, a survivor of sunshine and rain, silent witness to many an age. But this is no ordinary tree, for her trunk is hollow inside, and faithfully she keeps unseen the secret of her native tribe. For her caves a place of birth, a haven safe from danger, this womb of Mother Earth is Africa's child, Manga. The baobab stands proud and strong, as I believe we should. She serves her people as midwife. It's been this generations long. She is Africa's great tree of life. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that. We are running slightly late. Apologies. We'll try and make up some time. I'd like to invite, please, Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Ms. Barbara Creasy, to give her perspective of government. Where are we on the decarbonisation agenda, and of course, how are we accelerating the liberalisation toward this end? Barbara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you for affording me the honor of having an opportunity to share some views with you this afternoon. And I think that as we consider the opportunities around the green economy in the SADC region, it's important to start off by correctly identifying both the risks and the opportunities. So let's start, as many have done, with the science. Mike spoke about the 6th International Panel Report on Climate Change that was released in April. So what does it say? It says that the average world temperature has already increased by 1%, 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial times. And the sub-Saharan African region is warming up at twice the rate. So we're already on 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. Now, why does it matter? Well, what science tells us is that once we hit an average global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which the report says will hit in the next 5 years, then, as they say, the real you-know-what hits the fan. And those who have spoken before me have spoken about droughts and floods and storms and extreme weather events. And all of those things are what we call the physical risk of climate change. And this poses a risk to agriculture, to water security, to tourism, and of course to human health and well-being. But there's another risk, and it's important that we understand that risk today if we're to adequately work out how we would like the SADC region to respond. And that is what we call the transition risk. And the transition risk is all about the fact that as the rest of the world moves towards the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and by the way, all of our major trading partners as South Africa and the SADC region have already committed themselves, and that includes China, that is one of our major trading partners, to a mid-century commitment to net zero. So those trading partners are beginning to change the technological basis of their economy. And as they change the technological basis of their economy, so what they're going to want to do is to protect their investments. And that means that if we don't also change, we could find ourselves shut out of world export markets, our goods and services shut out of world export markets, and we could find a situation where we lose access to international capital markets because Nedbank's being very discreet today, but as we all know, our shareholders are taking decisions about the kinds of things that they would want to see international finance institutions investing in and not investing. And we know that there's a little dirty four-letter word that begins with a C and ends with an L, and not terribly popular these days. Coal. Not terribly popular these days. Let me give you an example. One of the sectors I'm responsible for is forestry. And you learn a lot when you're a cabinet minister, One of the things I learned is that forestry these days doesn't produce paper, it produces fiber, and fiber is used in the production of garments. We sell to two major markets, India and Italy. Both of those major markets have informed our fiber producers, reduce your carbon footprint by half over the next 5 years, or sell to someone else. Now, this is India we're talking about, okay? They also like the little word, the C word. But the consumers of textiles, young, fashion-conscious consumers, want to know about the carbon footprint of the garments they're buying. And a lot of the change that we're starting to see in the economy, this transition risk that I'm talking about, is driven by the financial and economic choices of young, climate change conscious consumers. So I'm raising this because not only do we have to be concerned as Southern African countries about the physical impact that climate change is going to have on us, and it is indeed, without getting into the Armageddon stories, going to be more than significant. But we also have to be concerned that if we don't get onto the new technological change bandwagon quick enough, we could find ourselves cut out of international goods and service markets. And we've got lots of opportunities, and we don't want to miss out on those opportunities. But for us to benefit from those opportunities, we're going to need to have a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is going to have to focus on our approach to development, but it's also going to have to focus on how governments in Southern Africa understand their priorities. Now, one of the things we know from all of the speakers who have come before me is that climate change is not something that just affects governments or economies. It's something that affects the whole of society. And because of that, you can't deal with climate change just through government policy or just through changing business practice. You have to have a whole of society approach to dealing with climate change. And this is the reason that our president took a decision to appoint the Presidential Climate Commission in 2020. This commission, it's a South African commission, represents government, business, organized labor, and civil society. And this body, representing all of these different sectors of our economy and our society, can boast the fact that it advised on the revised nationally determined contribution to reducing greenhouse gases under the Paris Agreement, and has just concluded the Just Transition Framework, which identifies some of the foundational principles on how our country should consider to approach issues of the just transition. And I'll let you into a little secret which you mustn't share with anybody until Friday morning. And that is that just transition framework is in the cabinet system, and it was adopted in the cabinet meeting this morning. So in due course, it is going to shape how everybody in our country approaches this issue of the just transition. And I suppose that one of the things we would then be wanting to say to our sister countries in the SADC region is, have a look at this document and see whether you think that there is any appropriateness in this document for the way in which we approach the transition in the whole of SADC. Because the whole of SADC requires a whole of society approach to the transition. The second issue that I can suggest in helping us to manage this whole of society approach is the issue of introducing a regulatory or legislative framework. Since 2010, when South Africa adopted our climate response strategy, we've been working on a voluntary basis to coordinate the work of different levels of government, different government departments, as well as stakeholders outside of government. And I must say that it hasn't been a bad process. But my belief is that as we get into the real nitty-gritties of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, it is useful to have a legislative framework. What we understand is that we're a developing country. SADC countries are all developing countries. Budgets are in short supply. Priorities are many. And if you want climate change to be somewhere important in the pecking order, it's going to be important to have that regulatory framework which makes certain interventions mandatory and which requires the allocation of budgets to those activities. Now, as signatories to the Paris Agreement, all of the SADC countries are required to approach climate change on three bases. The first of all is the issue of mitigation, and mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, the major emitter in Southern Africa is South Africa. So really one can say that that particular aspect of the Paris Agreement is most important for South Africa. The second area that all of us have to get involved in is adaptation. And that means dealing with all the realities that you've heard about earlier and putting in mechanisms that are going to deal with the fact that water is going to be in scarce supply. You are going to have to fundamentally change your agricultural basis and grow different crops because the climate is going to fundamentally change. You're going to have to deal with storm surges and cities that are going to be underwater and so on and so forth. So this issue of putting in place adequate adaptation strategies and financing those strategies is very important. And that brings us to the last aspect of the Paris Agreement, and that is what the agreement euphemistically calls means of implementation: money and technology and human capital. Now, I think that it's important to say that the SADC region as a whole contributes 2% to global CO2 emissions. It's very little. And the bulk of that comes from South Africa, and a major contributor to that 60% of those CO2 emissions comes from Eskom and the way in which we are generating our electricity. And so one needs to recognize that when we are dealing with the SADC region, this is a region that has contributed the least to climate change, but is going to be most severely impacted upon it. And therefore, for the SADC region, in the climate negotiations, issues of adaptation and the financing of adaptation is uppermost on the agenda. And you would understand that as we move into the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, relations between developed and developing countries have become more complex and more difficult. And one of the reasons for that has been that while the majority of developing countries, in fact all signatories to the Paris Agreement, have agreed that we need to set nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gases, and we need to review those every 5 years. What really concerns developing countries is the burden that climate change is going to place on the development agenda, on the standard of living, and of course, on budgets. So the Paris Agreement requires that developed countries that are responsible for the phenomena of climate change, because developed countries have been releasing CO2 gases into the atmosphere since the 1800s. Developed countries must contribute to the financial burden that developing countries face. And a long time ago, when after the Paris Agreement was negotiated, there was an agreement that developed countries will raise $100 billion to make this contribution. It hasn't happened. We're still waiting. I think up to now they're somewhere in the region of about $70 billion, and has already been pointed out by a previous speaker, this is not grant money. It's by and large loan money, and what it means is that in economies that are already facing serious loan burdens and are fiscally constrained, there is this added problem. So I've told you a lot about the risks. I've told you a lot about the burdens and a lot about the challenges. So what about the opportunities? Well, the opportunities are enshrined in the revised SADC Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan 2020 to 2030 that was adopted by SADC in June 2021. And this document identifies key sectors in the region that can contribute to the transition to a low carbon climate resilient future. And these sectors include energy, land use, forestry, agriculture, transport, and waste management. And in the action plan, as others have alluded to, the energy sector is identified as the low-hanging fruit. And when you think about it, it's obvious. In the Southern African power pool, 62% of power generation in the region is from coal, and only 32% of the rural population in the SADC region have access to electricity. So what we have here is an opportunity on the one hand to shift to a greener energy mix, and this is obviously something that the South African government is concerned with. And on the other hand, what we have is a situation of energy poverty in the rest of SADC that opens up the opportunities and the possibilities for investment into renewable energy. And I think many people here have already pointed out that the one thing we don't lack in Southern Africa is sunshine. So the SADC Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency launched in 2016, was established to oversee and upscale implementation of renewable energy and efficient energy generation. And the center manages a number of concurrent projects, including a renewable energy entrepreneurship support facility and the development of the H2 Atlas Africa, the Atlas of Green Hydrogen Generation Potential in Africa. And I think that this is one of the areas that is really exciting, and I'm assuming, Geoff, on your agenda today, you do have a number of speakers who would be reflecting on the green hydrogen value chain. The SADC Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan also acknowledges the region's forestry resources that have the potential to act as significant carbon sinks. And the SADC region's size and the fact that it includes the massive Congo rainforest means that it is home to almost 394 million hectares of forest and similar biological formations. Now, if these resources were to be adequately protected and integrated into the climate change adaptation and development planning agendas of SADC member states, they could act as carbon sinks contributing to climate change mitigation strategies of member countries. And of course, they could then be used for trading in the carbon markets. So these are two sectors, energy and forestry, that have been highlighted in this development plan, but we know that there are many others. There is the platinum value chain, and we know that both South Africa and Zimbabwe have more than adequate reserves of platinum. There are also all the minerals that go into the production of energy storage, and we know that many of the other SADC countries are rich in minerals such as lithium. And of course, energy and battery storage is very important if you're using renewables, because as we all know, the sun doesn't shine at night. But when we go home and we want to cook and watch television and supervise homework, we need to turn the lights on. And that is where battery storage becomes very important if we are primarily using renewables. Now, before I conclude, I just want to say a few words about this idea of the just transition. And the reason it's important is because all research indicates that climate change doesn't affect everybody equally. And as we move in to understanding and benefiting from the green economy, we want to make sure that we don't have a situation where some people are affected by the transition and other people are benefiting from the green economy. And so the work that the Presidential Climate Change has done on the Just Transition Framework was extensively consulted with a range of communities and organizations in sectors that are vulnerable to energy and other forms of climate-related transitions. And what came out very clearly in those consultations is that communities and workers were saying that we don't just want to be identified as potential beneficiaries. We want to be integrally involved in the processes that identify the risks, that understand what the alternatives are, and that implement those alternatives. So I think what is very interesting in this framework is the different conceptualizations of what justice would mean. And in this concept of justice, there isn't just the issue of participative justice and distributive justice. So it's not just the question that we want to be part of it and we want to be beneficiaries. But there is also a concept in the just transition framework that we have to deal with the fundamental inequalities and economic exclusions that exist in all of SADC countries as a result of both apartheid and colonial histories. And so it's important that we start to orientate ourselves in that direction. Because unless this technological revolution can help us to deal with some of the fundamental inequalities that exist in all of our societies, we're not going to find a situation where we're going to get buy-in that we need in order to make it a success. And so we are going to need active labor markets that can meet emerging human resource needs. We're going to need social protection for vulnerable individuals and households. Other colleagues have already spoken about the importance of economic diversification away from just extractive industries to building a manufacturing base on the subcontinent. And of course, issues relating to effective governance and finance. So let me conclude by saying that we recognize the role in all of this that regional bodies such as the SADC Secretariat and NEPAD can play in advancing the developmental agenda in the context of our desire for sustainable development. Through the SADC mechanism, our primary mandate is to pursue an accelerated sustainable development of the region's economy as a whole. Going forward, it will be important for us to forge a concerted regional scale implementation framework for the just transition in the interests of all countries in the region and all of their citizens. I want to wish you well in your deliberations today. I think that these discussions will help us to find plausible alternatives to attain the 2030 vision aspirations. And no doubt, we are going to hear diverse and multifaceted views from the region itself. I want to end with a quote from the young African climate change activist, Vanessa Nakate, who says, "Climate change is more than statistics. It's more than data points. It's more than net zero targets. It's about people, those that are being impacted on right now." Thank you very much.
Minister Barbara, thank you very much. Can I invite briefly the Deputy High Commissioner of Zimbabwe to South Africa, Mrs. Donga Sibanda. Just briefly, maybe a response to the Minister's comment or speech, in addition to which maybe a broader perspective from SADC, and then we'll go straight into the academic conversation. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Honorable Barbara Creecy, Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Mr. Geoff Rothschild, NEPAD Business Foundation Chairperson, Mr. Mpho Makwana, Nedbank Chairman, Mr. Mike Brown, Nedbank Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Martin Davis, Managing Director, Emerging Markets and Africa, Deloitte, Program Director, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored to be here today at this forum, which I believe is an important forum aimed at enhancing understanding on issues related to the green economy. On behalf of His Excellency Ambassador David Hamadziripi, who could not be here with us today. I wish to thank the Nedbank and NEPAD Business Foundation for hosting this important event. I'm largely going to present what the ambassador was going to say this afternoon. So my presentation will focus on what the government of Zimbabwe has done in its goal towards the green economy. I'll also touch on the role of government in general towards the green economy, and lastly, touch on the investment opportunities in Zimbabwe in that regard. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking at the recently held Zimbabwe Annual Investor Forum on 25 August, His Excellency President Edi Mnangagwa said, Zimbabwe, I quote, Zimbabwe is keen to increase its footprint in green energy solutions and the realization of the SDG number 7 for affordable, reliable, sustainable, and clean energy for all, end quote. The president has also said at different fora, making Zimbabwe green and just is key on the agenda of his administration. Our aspiration, therefore, as Zimbabwe is high when it comes to greening policies, especially those that embrace environmental justice. Put differently, our aspiration is high for a radically different economy, one that is driven by efficient agriculture, cleaner and cheaper energy with more jobs. As we all know, climate change is a defining challenge of our time, which threatens attainment of the Vision 2030. Urgent measures, therefore, are needed to transform the developmental approaches towards low carbon emissions and climate resilient development pathways. Zimbabwe is a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its attendant protocols, namely the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement calls on all parties to submit their climate change mitigation commitments, referred to as the nationally determined contributions, and long-term strategies, and develop towards a net zero emissions pathway. In response to the provisions of the Paris Agreement, Zimbabwe has developed the proposed costed economy-wide low emission development strategy, LEDS. The low emissions development strategy for Zimbabwe is in line with our own Vision 2030 of becoming an upper middle income green economy, and proposes sustainable climate change mitigation actions that can be implemented. In the most recent assessment of greenhouse gas emissions in Zimbabwe, the country was emitting approximately 35.84 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which constitutes less than 0.05% of the total global emissions. The LEDS identified 38 mitigation actions across the 4 intergovernmental panel on climate change recognized sectors, which are energy, waste, industrial processes and product use, and agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. Zimbabwe's implementation of these actions is going to achieve 40% reduction in emissions compared to the projected business as usual emission scenario by 2050. I will now briefly touch on Zimbabwe's revised nationally determined contribution. Zimbabwe's revised nationally determined contribution seek to reduce economy-wide per capita emission by 40% below the projected business as usual emissions scenario by 2030. It is 7% upward revision from the first generation, which focused on reducing energy-related emissions by 33% below the projected business as usual emissions by 2030. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sectors covered by the revised NDCs are energy, waste, industrial processes and product use, and agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors. I'll talk about the agriculture, forest, and other land use in Zimbabwe. This sector is contributing 44% of Zimbabwe's total emissions and is the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector. It includes emissions resulting from agricultural activities, from both crop and livestock production, burning of crop residue, and emissions from land use change. This sector has huge opportunities to take back greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, especially through forestry activities. Some key actions of this AFOLU sector include reducing area band afforestation and reforestation activities, as well as conservation agriculture, which has since been adopted by the government under our own Mfuvudza or Intwasa concept. This concept is a crop production intensification approach that allows farmers to concentrate resources on a small land unit to facilitate optimum management, resulting in increased productivity. The energy sector actions included in the revised NDS include renewable energy sector such as solar, biogas, and wind, energy efficiency improvements, reduced transmission and distribution losses, as well as modal transport shift from private to public transport mobility, among others. The waste sector greenhouse gas emissions contribute an estimated 6% of total emissions from Zimbabwe. Some key mitigation actions identified in the revised NDS for the waste sector include waste to energy projects, solid waste management through composting and liquid waste management. Zimbabwe's revised nationally determined contribution, like many developing countries that are vulnerable to climate change, also includes an adaptation component. The Honorable Minister referred to the need for adaptation. In the case of Zimbabwe, the 4 prioritized strategies for adaptation in the proposed revised NDS are to develop, implement, and scale up climate-smart agriculture solutions, including strengthening agricultural value chains and markets. Secondly, to enhance early warning and climate-related disaster risk reduction systems. Also to ensure climate-resilient infrastructure designs and development, and to develop and promote climate-resilient water resources management practices. In summary, the revised nationally determined contribution identifies 17 mitigation strategies contributing 40% per capita emission reduction by 2030, and 4 adaptation strategies to be implemented across all the sectors of the economy. Zimbabwe's revised nationally determined contributions are conditional on the provision of international climate change support. The mitigation target for Zimbabwe requires an estimated US $4.8 billion by 2030 in a combination of investment, capacity building, and technology transfer. To fully implement the NDC as a country, domestic, public, and private sector resource mobilization is critical to leverage international climate finances being pursued together with technology development and transfer support. This is because development cooperation finance is now linked to local contribution as a precondition. In the same vein, regional collaborations are also critical. I'll now talk about the role of government in general in green economy or net zero. The government has a leadership role in the green economy or net zero roadmap for signing up and ratifying the multilateral agreements that sets the framework towards a green economy. While economies like Zimbabwe and much of the developing world will find it difficult to attain net zero, there is need to further develop our industries. Efforts are being made to ensure we do this in a low emissions and green trajectory. Government develops and facilitates implementation of legislation, policies, strategies, and action plans for green growth. Zimbabwe's current National Development Strategy 1, which is implemented from 2021 to 2025, mainstreams climate change across all its thematic areas and sets priorities through its environmental protection, climate, resilience, and natural resources management, as well as the infrastructure, utilities, and digital economy, which aims to promote green growth. Government work has been done and has been initiated on the development of the climate change bill to guide implementation of low carbon technologies, establishment of the National Climate Fund to leverage incoming climate finances, as well as facilitate data sharing and flow for reporting purposes. Furthermore, the government has set pro-green growth policies, such as the National Climate Policy, Renewable Energy Policy, Biofuels Policy, to facilitate green growth. As recent as last year in 2021, government officially launched the National Renewable Energy Policy of 2019, which aims to have 26.6% of total generation capacity from renewables by 2030. To enable the implementation of specific actions, the policies propose establishment of funds for implementation. The government, therefore, has an important role in mobilizing resources to both domestic and international for implementation of actions towards a green economy from both public and private sectors. Considering the various economic and financial challenges, governments are amenable to further support from regional counterparts and financial institutions to enhance progress towards green economy and net zero. Zimbabwe has investment opportunities, as already alluded to by the previous speakers. Zimbabwe, like many other countries in the region, has abundant sunshine. So there are investment opportunities in solar energy. In terms of energy needs, Zimbabwe has a national demand of 2,200 megawatts, comprising daily peak demand of 1,600 megawatts in winter and 1,400 megawatts in summer. To continue delivering this, public-private synergies remain imperative. In that regard, government has since approved the implementation of a large-scale program to promote the importation, local production of solar equipment, and the use of solar power as an alternative energy source. With effect from April 2021, government exempted duty on the importation of solar panels and is offering duty-free import of solar energy production equipment in a bid to promote environmentally friendly sources of energy. Since 2021, 90 independent power producers have been licensed, which this serves just to confirm the openness of government to partner the private sector to promote clean energy. Independent power producers are thus therefore invited to explore the prospects of investing in solar energy projects in Zimbabwe. There are also numerous prospects in the agricultural sector. The country has about 4,130,000 hectares of arable land. About 25% of this land is cultivated using animal and manual drought power. And most of these, the landowners depend on rain rather than irrigation for their crops. So this suggests that there is a massive opportunity for investment in irrigation infrastructure. As I conclude, I wish to reiterate that governments have a key role indeed they have a responsibility for setting policies that save, advance, and promote the public's interest in transitioning towards an energy system that is more sustainable from both a supply and environmental standpoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Slight change of format. Can I invite Marius Oosthuizen from GIBS, School Institute of Business Science, to give his very informed perspective on current climate situation, a road ahead to net zero by 2050. Can I also, in the meantime, just to invite Catherine Kaufman and Anel Bosman from DBSA and Nedbank, respectively. Just take a hot seats in the middle. I'll join you there, and then Marius will join us for a conversation just after his formal presentation. Okay. Marius, over to you. Thank you so much.
Colleagues, good afternoon, and all protocol observed. I look forward to sharing with you some thoughts, both from the work that we're doing at GIBS, some of the research we're doing, but also from the World Energy Council, where we're doing a number of studies relating to the topic, and so looking forward to giving you that input. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the background. It's been mentioned, climate, the context in which this discussion takes place. And I know that a number of the, what shall we call them, scary stories about the impact of climate have been mentioned, extreme weather, flooding, etc. But I wanted to start by contextualizing why there is a burning platform for this just transition. We participated in an event at Oxford University called the Oxford Futures Forum, which brings futurists from all around the world together to talk about what are the tangible implications of a failure in the global just transition or the climate transition. What would that look like on the ground? We spent time during that process looking at the implications for Africa, specifically focusing on North Africa and the part of Africa called the Sahel region. Of course, the Sahel feels very far away from us, but it will tell you an interesting story about the implications on the ground. In the Sahel, we already have what we call a multi-dimensional conflict that has theological, ideological, social, military, and other components to it, running across that region from Senegal in the west all the way through to northern Kenya in the east. Now, in a 2-degree climate change scenario, the Sahel region becomes largely uninhabitable as a region. Now, to put that in context, in perspective, there are 200 million Africans who live in the Sahel region. In a 2-degree climate change scenario, what do you imagine 200 million Africans do? Well, simply put, 100 million migrate north and 100 million migrate south. The implications of that is that would make the migration crisis in the wake of the Arab Spring in Europe look like an absolute picnic. And it will turn South Africa and SADC and Sub-Saharan Africa's complexities around migration completely on its head and put us in a very different situation. And so this is the kind of implication that's at stake if we get the transition wrong. Now, there's the mitigation strategy to that, as the minister mentioned, but there's also the adaptation strategy. And what do we do to avert or to avoid or to minimize some of those massive unintended consequences of a failed transition? To get into that a little bit, let me quote from a study that we've recently done at the Energy Council, done by a group called our Future Energy Leaders. They call the FELS. They're a group of 100 energy leaders all around the world, sitting in energy companies, energy institutions. And what we had them do is compare global scenarios on energy. What are the long-term outcomes of the energy transition? And we had them very specifically look at the energy mix out to 2050. And what you see emerging here is a very interesting story that across these scenarios, and let me say this is the IEA, IRENA, Bloomberg, a number of different large institutions. We compared a total of 20 scenarios at the global level of what does the energy mix look like in 2050. The main observation, of course, is in the bright yellow, is that renewable energy plays a dominant role across the energy mix worldwide. Now, this has very positive implications for things like manufacturing. It does raise questions around the distribution of the supply chains for renewable energy components. To put it in context, today in Europe right now, in London in fact, if you order rooftop solar, you get put on a 6-month waiting period because of a combination of demand, supply chain disruption in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. And so this raises questions of the opportunity for Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, not just in solving our own energy transition, but also in participating in the global energy transition. A second notable one there, of course, is the bright red in the Bloomberg red scenario, the bright red representing nuclear. We think it's very likely that small-scale nuclear advances in nuclear technology, particularly in countries with larger fiscal capacity and in regions with the capacity to deliver those projects on time and at scale, we think that nuclear will obviously play a large role. Notably, coal is still present, but in a much reduced way compared to what the role is that it plays today. And very importantly, coal goes hand in hand in this context with CCUS, which is, of course, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're directing a major project in Saudi at the moment, looking at the circular carbon economy, CCUS in Saudi. And so the same principle applies in the oil industry to the coal industry, that coal will very likely play a role in the long term, but a much reduced role than it plays currently. Now, I want to take a step back to the global level before we come back to Africa for a second. We use this tool in the Energy Council called the Energy Trilemma, where we look at energy security, energy sustainability, and energy equity. And of course, in a perfect world, you would have a balanced trilemma where you have security, sustainability, and equity all worked out well. And it's no surprise that European countries top the list: Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, the UK, having the best ranked trilemma in terms of their current energy system. The current crisis precipitated by the conflict in the Ukraine has, of course, caused a shift in the European energy conversation. Over the last 15 years, the likes of Germany were predominantly having a conversation about energy sustainability, which meant that they were moving away from nuclear, moving away from coal, moving towards renewables. What the Ukraine crisis has done is it's upended the trilemma, and it's forced Europe to have an energy security conversation. And because of the high rates of inflation in the winter period and in the next year, in the next political cycle, Europe's going to be having an energy equity conversation. Now, there has, of course, been some, from an economic point of view, some upside to the shift. When this crisis happened, South Africa's coal exports to Germany multiplied by a figure of 8. And so there are some short-term upsides to this. What are the consequences for this shift in European energy conversations for the transition in Africa? Well, it means that the appetite for transition is going to take some pain. It's going to take some setbacks in the short term. It means that those in the parts of the energy system whose interests are not served by a transition are going to feel emboldened by this short-term setback in Europe. What we should guard against as Africa and SADC in particular is that we get carried away by the crisis in Europe and use the crisis in Europe as an excuse to not deal with the fundamental opportunity for a transition in Africa. On the right-hand side there is, of course, the photo of President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law. You'll see him handing the pen to his colleague in the Congress who walked that legislation through Congress. Why is it important to think about the legislation being passed in the US? Because even while Europe is going through this reformation of their energy environment in the short term, this shock in their energy environment, the US is moving very rapidly towards an energy transition. This legislation was signed in the same week that the White House issued their strategy towards Africa. And if you read the strategy towards Africa, it talks at length about economic diplomacy. Now, why is economic diplomacy from the US important in this conversation for SADC? Because one of the main drivers of industrial development and a rise in incomes in Asia of the last 50 years was the pivot of the US towards Asia, particularly China. And so what we see in our scenario analysis is a possibility of a pivot of the US and Europe towards Africa and Latin America, perhaps India to some degree, as they try and mitigate the implications of the Ukraine conflict, as they deal with the fallout of rising tensions between the US and China. And what that means is that it creates an opportunity for Africa if we can position ourselves to partner with the likes of the US, Europeans, and others as part of our energy transition. Now, the last study that I want to cite before I finish my inputs is a piece of work we did at Gibbs, where we looked at the top 12 energy utilities across Africa. We worked with the Africa Utilities Week, and we engaged the CEOs of those utilities, looking at what are the long-term futures of African utilities. I won't take you through the whole study, and I recognize that this slide is overwhelming and complex, but I'll point you to two important observations. This is a systems analysis of the drivers and trends shaping the future of energy in Africa. And two important things to note. On the top left, that red circle represents what we call a vicious cycle between bankruptcies in utilities, so utilities not being financially and economically viable, combined with the role of government bailouts, combined with political interference or political influence, combined with debt burdens, the lack of fiscal space, of course. And this creates an environment in which the governance and fiscal viability of our often state-led energy companies are precarious, to say the least. Now, next to that is that green circle, which of course is the big opportunity that we're talking about today. And within that green circle, if you had the time to study it or read the report, you'll find there's a virtuous cycle which is centered on the use of renewable energy, the adoption of renewable energy through government readiness and regulation, through public-private partnerships, driving an African growth story, enabling foreign direct investment. And so it's a little bit like a tug of war between the vicious cycle on the top left and the virtuous cycle in the middle to understand where will Africa go in the next 50 years with regards to energy. One other item to point out, top right on that system, of course, is the issue of regional integration. You cannot unlock the virtuous cycle that renewable energy represents without improving regional integration, which is, of course, why this conversation in SADC is so important. And I'll conclude with this remark. So after processing all of that analysis, we arrived at 4 possible scenarios for how the energy transition plays out in Africa. The worst among them is what we call the elephant herd scenario. Top right, it's a combination of poor financial resilience combined with isolated and monopolistic behavior, either by governments or by government and the private sector, or the private sector acting monopolistically in these spaces. And so what you have is an elephant herd scenario. You know what elephants do when they come in a herd and there are too many of them for the land to carry? They push the trees over, they kill the vegetation, and they leave destruction in their wake. And there's a very real possibility that the energy transition in Africa could result in an elephant herd scenario, which of course involves major extractive behavior, not just by the private sector, but by governments themselves, with African populations bearing the brunt. The second scenario, which is not great, bottom right, is what we call the white elephant scenario. This is a scenario where burdensome finances, a fiscal stitch-up between the public sector and the private sector, precipitated by monopolistic and plutocratic or extractive partnerships between government and business, result in this construction drive of what we call the white elephant scenario, where we end up with a range of stranded assets that are not linked to where the demand is, that are not sustainable, that are not linked to communities benefiting from that productivity. And so we see a short-term flurry of activity, but we see in the long term Africa sitting with this white elephant scenario. Of course, there's a major climate risk, because what that scenario represents is a scenario where Africa's energy system is not decentralized, highly vulnerable to extreme weather events, climate shocks, things like flooding, things like drought, etc. The last two, bottom left, the hungry hyenas scenario. This is a more nuanced scenario where what the private sector and the public sector do is they find each other in a synergistic collaboration where they form partnerships and projects for green sustainable energy, a little bit like the IPP program. But the structuring of those deals and the way in which those deals relate to the communities affected by those projects. So these are communities of mines, upstream, downstream, communities of labor that are connected to those projects, that structure is not viable long term. A little bit what the minister alluded to, that the inherent inequalities surrounding that development are not addressed. And so you end up with this energy transition, this green transition, really being like a pack of hyenas who themselves don't hunt, but they come after the fact and they benefit from the spoils of someone else's efforts. Of course, top left is the ideal scenario, which of course I think this forum is trying to precipitate, which we call the Pride of Lions or the Lions of Africa scenario. This is a scenario in which we find a model where the private sector can mobilize the capital and the capabilities, the technical capabilities. The public sector can enable a legislative and regulatory environment that is enabling of the transition, but we do that through a model that connects with the grassroots needs, things like job creation, inclusion, equitable distribution of the benefits of this green transition. And of course, a best case scenario is that SADC and Africa, for that matter, position ourselves in the process of that in a way that allows us to benefit from the geopolitical and geostrategic environment in which we find ourselves. I hope I've painted a backdrop of some thoughts, and I look forward to engaging the panel on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and I hope to explain the role Nedbank can play towards the top left, the Lion of Africa, as opposed to any of the others. I think many of the things have been raised before, and the reality we face right now and the impact of the climate change and our economies and societies had made me think about a quote from the Hopi elders' prophecy. And it was written, "You have been telling people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. We are the ones we have been waiting for." I think that's the crux of what we're actually talking about today. And I'm not going to repeat what many of the others have said, but at the risk of stating the obvious, the climate change is very real, and there's a growing global danger, specifically in humanity. And actually, this is a complex problem that will only solve itself through the economy if all levels actually act together. And this is the opportunity that we have to accelerate the initiatives. Net zero is a systems concept and cannot be delivered by any business or sector in isolation. Rather, we need a holistic approach across the system. And this requires strategic coordination, very much like you said, and collaboration, as the problem is complex, multidimensional, and actually we live in a complex adaptive system. And then the aim is to reduce our carbon outputs in each of the elements across the supply chain. And this we can only do through coordinated initiatives, including efficiencies, new sources, and recycling. And let's not forget that one of the hippos in the room is actually also our absolute levels of consumption. In the South African context, we have Eskom as our central problem, and I think many things have been saying about that, and the impact that it will actually have on our ability to export, because embodied carbon is becoming a determinant factor in the consumer's decision-making process. The fiber in the Italian clothes, and I never thought about that. And then along traditional factors such as quality and price is starting to have an impact on how consumers actually choose what they want. And then on the other side, there's the taxes and tariffs that will make us uncompetitive unless we can actually transform ourselves to be able to deliver products that comply to all the requirements. But in South Africa, we actually found ourselves in a paradoxical situation. We have the deficit of energy on the one side, but also that gives us the unique opportunity to decarbonize on the other side. We can address the energy crisis, maintain energy independence, and at the same time, adopt renewable energy technologies. And that's actually where banks such as Nedbank can play a significant role, because we are the distributors of funding. We can play a key role in driving transition. Accordingly, we can play in more than one way. On the one hand, We can be supporting the private sector in renewable energy generation and focus on the supply chain. And on the other hand, there's actually the work that we can do to give South Africa and Eskom stability. And we've deployed significant amounts of money, and Mike has referred to it, and we've actually participated in 42 of the 92 projects so far, with 33 billion of funding dispersed. Now, at the heart of the net zero strategy is also the calculation and reporting on the carbon embodied in a product. And that gives buyers the ability to decide what they want to use. Now, the problem with that is the numerous methodologies for estimating the embodied carbon, and it introduces difficulties for the users of the information, and therefore a standardized calculation and reporting methodologies across the industry is really paramount. And as a bank, we significantly invest in these systems and processes for measuring and recording, but it also provides data to help us to make informed decisions. And we're really hoping that the industry will standardize. Now, many studies have shown that a carefully managed, and it has been discussed today, will over the on the medium to long term actually have significant multiplier effects in our economy. And this is especially true for the developing and emerging markets. And we've heard actually how all of that can actually lead to new job opportunities, increase the livelihoods for our communities, and also decrease the risk for business and investors. If you think about the CO2 emissions per dollar for GDP produced in South Africa, that's very high, even though as individuals or per capita, our usage is very low. But this actually creates, and that is also the case in most emerging economies. And that is actually where the business opportunity arises, because we can reduce emissions and actually grow the economy at the same time. And that is where the partnerships will actually help us to address these challenges. How can funding models actually play a role in all of this? Commercial lenders and investors such as Nedbank, as capital and funding allocators, can play a crucial role in catalyzing the transition purely through the funding choices. It is true, the climate transition will come at the cost, as players in emerging economies will need to invest in greener technologies and infrastructure to curb the emissions. This costs create a market barrier and slows players from implementing initiatives that could actually support the transition. However, drawing on innovative finance, such as a blended finance, which has alternative sources of funding to provide a more competitive source, can assist in the lowering of the costs and therefore actually incentivize a quicker transition. Innovative funding mechanisms such as green bonds, that our chair actually referred to, green loans, are becoming a useful way to raise capital so that we can actually achieve these objectives. Tying up capital to specific conditions and requiring evidence, and that's where the measuring of it comes in again, through reporting is an effective way to stimulate greener investment and economic spending, which allows everybody to tap into new sources of funding. We've seen sustainably linked loans and bonds, which we have pioneered in South Africa, and those are excellent examples of innovative funding mechanisms that have been developed. The market has grown exponentially with increased take-up from our clients in South Africa and globally, as everybody opts for financing, which is inherently incentivizes them to progress on their ESG commitments. Now, what I should also do is give you a few examples of all of this, because I say we need to walk the talk. And I spoke about all the investments we have into the renewable projects, but we've also funded a 1 billion sustainably linked revolving credit for one of our clients, and it's their first, Imperial, and they agreed to deliver sustainable performance targets, which will then be measured on the improvement of the ESG and actually lead to a lowering of the interest cost. We've also done a revolving credit facility for 2 diamond mines, which includes sustainably linked tranche. And then our funding contains sustainably performance targets that encourage the implementation of initiatives by the mines to reduce overall carbon emissions, and improve the water quality where they are situated. We've acted as global coordinator for many deals, and one of our clients, Harmony Gold, which compromises of a big green loan, sustainably linked revolving credit, and actually also internationally dollar finance credit. And all of this to make the client able to invest in their projects. We also look at trades across the supply chain, where we actually do syndicated borrowing-based facilities. And this one we did for Trafigura, one of the world's largest independent oil and metal traders. But what has been done is ambitious targets to include in the facility to encourage the advancement of critical sustainability priorities. And that's actually how we mix it. We've also done various property where with our clients, the loans are linked to specific targets that they have, and it is to make the buildings green, and in that way we actually have listed use of proceeds, green loans, so that our clients can build more renewables. So it is therefore that significant funding support from the developed world to support the just transition as we decarbonize needs to find its way to these projects. The largest constraint is in the capacity of the countries and institutions to deploy the scale of the funding requirement. Now, one solution is to better utilize local commercial funding capacity and the capital in the commercial banks. And then rather than providing financial support in the form of funding, as we've spoken before, that is still a loan, there is far better leverage by providing support in the form of risk enhancements, such as payment guarantees and other mechanisms. This will provide the additional benefits of local capital, avoiding currency risks in the projects, and actually developing the domestic capital markets and our implementation capacity. Now, our role within the financial sector is critical as an influencer on business. That role is to steer our capital towards economic activities that support the future and away from the activities that don't. The decision the sector makes today regarding capital allocation and funding will shape tomorrow's economy. Granted, many of us won't be around, but it is still very important that we shape that economy. Businesses must look beyond short term as the key measure of success and actually consider the reality that without a concerted effort and focus in halting climate change, transforming our natural systems, protecting our biodiversity, and a more just, equitable, and prosperous future for all, it is unlikely. And therefore, therein lies the challenge of bold leadership. And what do I see as bold leadership? The curiosity to learn, the courage to unlearn, the conviction to decide, and the compassion to care. And with that, I invite us all to be bold.
I think I should probably just provide the context from where I'm speaking from, which is from the Development Bank of South Africa. The bank has also adopted a net zero policy because we basically follow our shareholder, which is South African government. And that commitment means that we have to contribute to that collective commitment made by 200 countries, I think some time ago in the Paris Agreement, 2016, the Paris Agreement, to maintain global warming below 2% degrees Celsius, but preferably at 1.5%, which means by 2030 we have to cut emissions down by 45%, which is a daunting task already. And then of course net zero in 2050. I think most importantly for all of us to understand from a DFI perspective, we have different drivers for what we deem successful, and we've got a development mandate. And I listened to Anel talk about pricing, and pricing is extremely important for sustainability. But I think as we embark on this transition journey, the metrics we measure ourselves by are going to be very important. And there's probably going to be some consideration of skin in the game in terms of how we incentivize even commercial banks on what it means to be committed and contributing towards our very ambitious net zero target. So we can talk about that some more as we get into the discussion. But the other issue is that once we adopted the policy for the South African government, which was the net zero policy, we also issued our own statement at COP26, which was that we will continue to fund fossil fuels on condition that we are presented with a clear and unambiguous transition plan by those borrowers. So it's not funding fossil fuels at all costs, but as a transition path towards net zero. And the reason for that has been highlighted by many of the speakers, including the Honourable Minister earlier, that we have to consider the fact that most of our economy comes from coal, and that means most of our jobs support coal industry, is supported by the coal industry. And as we embark towards a net zero world, we have to see how we take the rest of our citizens along, including SADC and beyond SADC, because like yourself, we also invest in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of funding was going to be required, and funding that is focused on low emission gas infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. By resilient infrastructure, I mean infrastructure that in the future can withstand what is caused by climate change, like the floods we saw in KZN, and there's more of that to come. So we needed collectively as funders, commercial and DFIs, to start looking at how we collaborate and collaborate strategically to make an impact on this journey. More than 200 banks signed up to the UNEP financial principles for responsible banking after the Paris Agreement. And that was really to commit banking activities to be aligned with what we've committed as countries to the Paris Agreement. So we've got partners around us to assist us on this journey, but we've got to understand where we all play. And it sounds like the commercial banks do all the sexy stuff. And the enabling environment is, that's where our world is as DFIs, and that is entirely correct. Our job is to make sure that we participate in policy intervention, change of legislation, as was mentioned earlier, whether it's helping with the development of a taxonomy that defines what a green asset really looks like and green investment looks like, or whether it's to identify green hydrogen corridors or other opportunities, financial opportunities to help us pivot away from coal and develop more green skills, so to speak. So I think for us, what you also need to realize is that in the job of enabling, although we are not known to be innovative, remember, banks don't, especially infrastructure banks, do not invest in projects with technologies that aren't proven, with developers that don't have a track record. So where we need to play a role as DFIs is to invest in these new green technologies, is to invest in projects that you wouldn't have appetite for, to make sure they work a little before they come to market. So to establish the market first. And once we have hit on a great idea, we develop a program around it. So once you've done a pilot, you develop a program around it. And I think somebody else spoke about a program. And Nedbank is also, I think, believe that in order to deliver at scale and speed, you have to do so programmatically. So from that perspective, I think we aligned in terms of the type of investments we'd look at once we have prepared once we've created an enabling environment and prepared a pipeline of projects that are bankable or something that you would be interested in. So I think from that perspective, that is our key role. Our second extremely important role is what Anel started talking about, which is where do we fund to make sure that projects are bankable or incentivized to invest in projects that are new, that are unfamiliar, but gets us to net zero. And I think by providing lines of credit, either tier 2 capital, funder to funder capital that's concessional, or by providing concessional funding into projects that you wouldn't have banked, but because we've brought in deeply concessional pricing, long tenors, because DFI capital is usually patient, and we created a blended finance structure that we all can participate in. That is also an option. By providing credit enhancement guarantees for municipalities that, for instance, balance sheets aren't great, if they want to, there's a new EACHA program that we've just started rolling out, which is embedded generation for municipalities. It's not only for municipalities, but it's focused on municipalities. And we know balance sheets for municipalities aren't great. So by providing a guarantee behind a municipality that you would be concerned about cash flows and end user payments, that is also a role that I think that DFIs can effectively play. I'm acutely aware of my colleague shifting on my left. I think he wants to ask us questions, but I just want to end off by saying, is it easy ones? Okay. I just want to end off by saying that very important for us is the DFI, and I think it should be important for everyone, is that localization is not a swear word. You cannot, and I think Nedbank actually did localization long before anyone thought about it, when they started with a green mandate more than 14 years ago. Because localization is about how do we ensure we continue to have operational legitimacy going forward. And that means how do we engage with society as we do what we do. So localization, making sure that where we're closing down factories, where we are transitioning, we make sure that locals participate. In a real sense, it's an indictment on all of us that 12 years after RIP, most of our funding is still capacitated by foreign capacity in terms of technical capacity. There's been a lot of movement, but it's still not where it's supposed to be. And we welcome foreign investment. We appreciate foreign investment. But if you want accelerate adoption of a transition strategy, you have to make sure that people at local level also benefit in terms of jobs and new skills, because that is what gives them dignity. And that is what enables all of us to continue to operate in those environments. So we shouldn't make excuses for that. In the spirit of quotes I heard today, I was sitting on the chair back there and I realized that one quote is probably really apt, which I quote to my kids usually, is that we're born looking like our parents, but we die looking because of decisions we made ourselves. So going forward, we need to consider that the choices we make next are going to be very important in what we leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this microphone on? Okay, great. I've got 3 questions briefly. We have 3-4 minutes before we take a quick break for the next session, which Peter will run. Marius, firstly, in a typical sort of academic, intangible question from myself. You talk about sort of a region up in Sahel, the northern part of the continent, and the incredible environmental pressures on population. We talk about decarbonization, green economy, etc. But what happens to large swathes of our continent where carbon is the only show in town? think oil producing, gas producing economies. I'm thinking pretty much Angola upwards, the entire west coast of Africa, including the largest economy on the continent, that is Nigeria. All of this is all very well, of course, but when your economy is entirely dependent on commodities, i.e., a single commodity, how realistic are these goals we're setting?
Look, it's the question from a global south point of view when we talk to continents other than Africa, Asia, Latin America, energy access, energy affordability is the main conversation because of underdevelopment. If you asked me that question 10, 15 years ago, I might have said, well, industrialization, basic progress from the primary economy to the second economy to the tertiary economy is unavoidable. Carbon is part of that story. And we need to make trade-offs. What we are seeing now with renewable energy is the decentralization of energy production through things like renewable. With smart technology, we're seeing the decentralization of other technologies like information technology. And through this advent of virtual working through COVID, we're seeing the possibility of a reorganization of the basic social structure. So when we look back 200-300 years at the shape of industrialization and what that meant for human society, it meant urbanization, large infrastructure, coal heavy, and it meant governments had to provide large scale infrastructure to support that. Those rules may not apply to Africa, and so what I would argue for is Africa needs a much more sophisticated visionary strategy that says how do we get millions and millions of Africans energy access, jobs and productivity without necessarily tying them to a carbon heavy future, and I think the technology is there to do it.
Very much so, and also lessons may be emerging perhaps in similar identical challenges in the Middle East, GCC, for example. And now to yourself, you spoke about 33 billion rand odd of financing, 42 of 92 projects Nedbank has participated in. Clearly, the opportunity for me from the outside seems to be this is a policy-driven, liberalization-driven opportunity for financiers in South Africa. In light of relatively recent liberalization from 1 to 100 megawatt sort of cap, are you able to quantify the current pipeline? And what I'm trying to get at here is how do you value or put a number on the benefits of liberalization in recent weeks?
Sure, that would be an instant calculation, but nevertheless, I think the first thing is Nedbank invested in our renewable skills long before other banks did, and that really put us in a good position to reach those statistics that you have been saying. In the same vein, we have a significant market presence in mining, which is the one natural type of sector to actually do commercial and industrial. So unfortunately, these things take about 18 months to come to fruition from the lifting of the cap to the clients, but we actually see them coming through now, and it's a significant pipeline. I don't think it will surpass the official renewable project soon, simply because of scale, but there is a strong pipeline, and we see other types of financing coming through as well. For instance, an independent producer with off-takers, but then you need to think how you think about the risk. Is it specific to an off-taker, or can you actually look at it through the lens of it is energy production, which takes you to the white elephants, and how do you actually manage all of that? It's hard to quantify, but it is a significant business activity in CIB, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Now, last question, Captain. Thank you for the great views. Something that's been sort of challenging me in recent times is that post COP26, the agenda is all ESG, and clearly the biggest letter in the room here is E of the ESG. Very quickly, ESG seems to have supplanted SDGs as the acronym that we all speak about. Considering the commodities underpin of so many economies, countries in this part of the world, the pursuit of ESG targets, as all of you have outlined, seems to be on the surface almost in conflict with the pursuit of SDGs. How do we reconcile the two? intentionally provocative question.
Yes, I thought they're going to be easy. I think that as you deliver on ESG commitments, you are directly and indirectly dealing with SDGs. You know, you're dealing with, and it's how you implement it. So if you're going to do a renewable energy, even this liberalization, which there's opportunity there to engage with the SDGs, whether it's gender, whether it's health. If you're going to provide embedded solar for a hospital, you are dealing with an SDG through health. If you make sure that you gender mainstream a particular project, you're dealing with gender issues. So I think they are very easy to inculcate. I don't think they'll be left behind because we are so focused on meeting ESG targets. Yeah.
Catherine, great, thank you. Catherine, Maurice, and Al, thank you so very much.
Okay, welcome back, and very good to have colleagues from the private sector joining us up here. I think you'll all agree what we've heard so far has been very rich and very thought-provoking. We are aware that we are running quite far behind, so we acknowledge that, but I do think it's just looking at what we've still got to come, there's quite a lot of areas where we will catch up. So we do acknowledge the importance, and I see the excitement, and sorry to be the Grinch to bring you back from having some conversations with people you haven't seen for a long time. So apologies for that. So we'll dive very quickly into this session. So I'm joined by Mr. Mpho Makwana, Chairman and Managing Director at Siemens Energy Southern Africa. Thabo, hello. Ms. Sierra Makabela, Group Head of Corporate Affairs, Anglo American, also an NBF board member. Thank you very much for being with us. Mr. Dumasani and Carla, Vice President, Low Carbon Energy Solutions and from Sasol. And the intention of this session is just to hear from business on what it is that they are doing, and in doing it, to understand what it is that governments can do to leverage that and to make it more impactful. And in all the sessions and all the different initiatives that we're involved in, with the ability to share this knowledge and this experience with other businesses we've seen has been very fruitful. So that's the intention. Perhaps we can start with Sierra from Anglo American, just to share with us your Anglo American's views and what we've heard so much exciting news about in the press over the last year at least.
Good evening, colleagues. Good. You have to stop me. I get excited when I speak about what we do in this space. So I'll start first, Peter, by saying thank you so much to the NBF and Nedbank for inviting us to share our story, and also to share this platform with what I call collaborators. We sit in the Energy Council of South Africa with Sasol, and we have various committees in there, and it's really meant to be a collaborative platform. We also engage quite a bit with Siemens Energy on various issues relating to renewables, as well as skills of the future. So it's good to share the platform with these colleagues. I would like to say that from an Anglo-American perspective, we've been thinking about the role that we can play as a mining company. We have been thinking about the role that South Africa should play in the hydrogen economy. And this was informed by what I think some of the earlier speakers highlighted, particularly the minister, that South Africa is well endowed with PGMs. We are the leading PGM producer in the world. And PGMs include your platinum, include your palladium, including lithium that she spoke about. We have these minerals and we are leading in them. And therefore, it makes sense that if we're going to talk about green hydrogen, this country should be in the forefront and should be among competing nations. And we are the producer, obviously with other colleagues, and so it made sense for us to start thinking about this early, quite early, more than 10 years ago. We also had to think about this because, you know, they say if it's not farmed, it's mined. And with farming, I believe you can choose where you farm. If Israel can farm in the desert, I think you can choose where you farm. But with mining, you can't. And when I go around Anglo's mines around the world, I often say to them, you don't know how complex farming in South Africa is because we have what is called community mines. Our mines are found next to communities. And because of that, it's impossible to think about the future, whether it is in transition, without thinking about the just of it. And so this informed our own strategy years ago, where we said, as Anglo-American, we have to look at our strategy in terms of renewables and how we are going to involve South Africa, how we are going to involve communities, how we are going to engage with government and other colleagues to make sure that our policy puts South Africa in the forefront in terms of the hydrogen economy. These discussions for us internally have been anchored by our purpose. So we looked at our purpose and said, our purpose as Anglo-American is to reimagine mining to improve people's lives. And by that, we said we cannot harm the environment. We have to leave the environment either the way we found it or better. And by the environment, I include the air, I include water use. We are a high water user. We are a high energy user, intensive user, energy user in South Africa. And we said, how do we make sure that we actually get to carbon neutrality? And we use this purpose as our anchor. And our strategy and targets, and I think it was you, Mike, who mentioned the targets that Nedbank set itself. We set ourselves these targets a couple of years ago and said to ourselves, as Anglo-American publicize them, we will get to carbon neutrality in all our sites around the world by 2030. We also said we will reduce our, and I would like to say that about 8 of our sites around the world have already achieved carbon neutrality. We also said we will reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2040, and we will also reduce our Scope 3 emissions by 2040, by 50% by 2040. And at the time, it looked like a stretch target, but actually, I'm comfortable to say, based on the technologies that we have deployed, based on the plans that we have put in place, it's starting to look like it's going to be possible. And the way we are approaching this is we are looking at a regional renewables strategy. And just a week ago, I was explaining to someone that think about it this way. So we have PGMs. So we can actually convert this into fuel cells that can, we can use in terms of generating electricity and also on our mines, but also to actually provide power, our trucks. At the current moment, we have already announced, and I was there for us to convert our diesel powered haulage trucks at the mines to convert them into hydrogen fuel trucks. This is possible. And if we can do those 40 in South Africa, which we think is possible, the technology is tested, we know it's working, we can actually convert more than 400 trucks that are on our sites around the world. We also said, so we have the fuel, we have the PGMs, we have solar and wind. And we have said we are going to have this ecosystem that is placed in and outside our mines and generate electricity. And that electricity, so take it as a virtual grid system that Anglo has put up. We are going to use that and distribute that to all our mines. And we are going to also alleviate the pressure in terms of electricity security and supply within our communities, but also create jobs and opportunities that did not exist before. This is the position that we have taken, and these technologies we are speaking about, some of them we've already tested them, In 2014, we powered in Kronstadt a whole township with what I'm talking about in terms of fuel cells. We have partnered with others. We have partnered actually with government, with Department of Science and Technology, and other partners, NG, Bambili, Energy, to grow and look at how we can harness what South Africa has to grow a hydrogen economy. And these technologies, we're already deploying them in the Mogalakwena Bushveld area, the greater Johannesburg, and we are going to expand beyond 835 kilometers from Mogalakwena, which is in Limpopo, where most of our PGM mines are, all the way to Durban. If we can do this, we think that, and we have already identified 9 projects, we think we can unlock so much value for South Africa in terms of contribution to the GDP as well as jobs. So I think this is possible. We also recognize we can't do this alone, hence why we get involved in collaborative partnerships with colleagues here and others. So in the Energy Council, we found this, the Energy Council, is it last year? I think it's last year or a year ago, when we realized that we have to have an Energy Council in South Africa so that we have one voice, we engage on policy issues and advocacy issues with one voice. We have different committees in there, and we have not been exclusionary in terms of the members. But the main purpose of the council is for us to drive renewables and green hydrogen in South Africa.
Yeah, thanks so much. Certainly an encouraging story, and congratulations to the leadership in making it happen. I think lots of us all to learn from your experience. Thabo, swiftly over to you, from a different perspective, no doubt, but interested to hear.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the invitation as well. I think to first open up, I mean, if you listen to the prior speakers as well, we, as a developing region, we're sitting with one of those dual problems. You know, the first one is how do you industrialize, which traditionally has been off the back of fossil fuels. But at the same time, you mitigate some of these greenhouse emissions that we need to deal with. So it's a balancing act that we need to navigate. Around the same context, Siemens Energy finds itself as a energy technology company that in its portfolio has sort of a conventional technologies that includes we've done quite a significant amount of work in gas and coal and so on, HFO, diesel, with the peakers in South Africa. And we've also got a portfolio which would coined it a decarbonized portfolio. So that's where we've got all our solar, wind, battery storage and so on, and even green hydrogen, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the reality when we get into how do we green SADC, you know, we first have to start with ourselves and say, where are we placing Siemens Energy ourselves? So we decided we'll be the key partner and player within the energy transition space. And what that meant for us internally was we needed to be quite bold about actions that we need to take to support that. So the first one was we dropped any future new coal power plants. We will not support, we will not supply turbines, transformers, zero, even a bolt, by the way. And then when we came to the view around gas, we looked at the technologies, the maturity of the technologies, be it in the decarbonized portfolio and in the conventional side, and we realized that we do need something that will transition us to the decarb. The current technologies have got limitations at an industrial scale. So we talk about battery. It's not industrially cost effective, neither is green hydrogen, by the way. So, you know, and the grids are not ready for that kind of a transition we need to take. So gas becomes an important player in that space to be able to transition us to where we need to get to. But the other view we took on gas was we made sure that all the equipment that you buy, which are gas related, do not end up becoming stranded assets. So hydrogen-ready gas turbines become quite an important feature there. So when the time comes, you need to switch to hydrogen, you are able to do so at a fraction of the cost of other than leaving the asset alone. So that's how we viewed our transition, Jen. Then in our decarbonized portfolio, I think Ciara has already expanded on one of the initiatives that they're doing. This is what we try and help our partners with. But the greater focus we've placed is on green hydrogen. I think globally we've got over some like 11 or 12 pilot plants we've done, testing various use cases of green hydrogen, all the way from Porsche on how they can use green fuels, to the airline industry, to using green hydrogen to generate electricity and so on. And after surveying all of those, we came out with the conclusion that we really need to scale up on green hydrogen. It is the future fuel of for usage. It offers significantly better benefits than any of the other options. But at the same time, if we really want to decarbonize industries, you need something a bit more heavier, whereas solar would not, and wind would not get you there. So that's the view we took in terms of our portfolio. We've scaled up investments in the green hydrogen space. We're opening up and we're still constructing a gigawatt scale green electrolyzer factory in Berlin. And each year we'll scale it up by 1 gigawatt. The idea is that if we can drive down the same sort of trajectory that solar had taken when it first came up and get green hydrogen to that level, then I think we'll see the change and the impact that we're really looking for. But the last element I want to talk about is something around that Ciara alluded to, is the know-how. The know-how relates to how do we simultaneously build green skills? How do we simultaneously build capability on operating these electrolyzers, or that's already happened around solar, around wind, and so on. But we really need to scale up that skill set. But coupled with that, there's a skill set which these technologies are becoming a lot more digitalized. They're becoming a lot more tech heavy. So we have to make sure that the skill sets of the future that we build do not leave people behind and are able to leverage from this growth.
Yeah, thanks very much, Thabo. And interesting some of the calls that you made as a business. Very interesting to hear that from yourselves and very credible. Thank you. Dumasani, from Sasol's perspective.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I think from a Sasol perspective, I think I was actually surprised that in all the discussions earlier on, when they were mentioning Eskom, Sasol wasn't mentioned in terms of the emissions. After Eskom, we are the second biggest emitter in terms of greenhouse gases in South Africa, and that makes us one of the most important participants when it comes to the South African government's ambitions around the NDC, and that's why it's so important for us to collaborate very closely with the government in terms of the decarbonization of South Africa. But similar to my other colleagues, we're looking at it also from a regional perspective. So we're looking at an integrated picture from a Sasol side in terms of how we're approaching the decarbonization roadmap. I'll quickly touch on that. But before I do that, maybe just to give an idea in terms of where Sasol is, we have committed to 30% reduction on our greenhouse gases by 2030. And that's we have a definite roadmap that will get us to there. And then we have an ambition to reach net zero by 2050. Our strategy around decarbonization is anchored on 3 pillars. The first pillar, which really carries us all the way to close to 2030, is around improving efficiencies, but also bringing in cleaner technologies in terms of our operations in Secunda and Sasolburg. We are currently in the process of procuring 600 megawatts of electricity with a target of getting 1.2 gigawatts of electricity into Secunda. That will allow us to replace most of the coal-generated electricity, and that will improve significantly in terms of our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions. But parallel to that, similar to, I think Thabo has touched it on and other colleagues have touched on it, is that we see the need for gas as a transition fuel, especially if you're a coal-based operation. And therefore, we actually have a very strong drive on the procurement of additional gas to the gas that we're currently procuring from Mozambique, which is in the middle of Mozambique in area Pand and Temane gas fields. That's always been operating for the last 20 years. And the idea is that we add more into those gas, and that will allow us to reduce our coal dependency, because coal is more, it has more impact on emissions than gas. So, and also give us more time to scale up on the green hydrogen. We are currently looking at opportunities to procure LNG, and that LNG is supposed to be, is going to help us to then transition into gas and reduce our coal dependency. And then in addition to doing the gas, in procuring the additional gas, we also now setting a number of catalytic projects on the green hydrogen, because that's what will take us to net zero by 2050. We are in the process of developing a green hydrogen production project in Sasolburg, and that will be, we will be producing, we have a 60 megawatts electrolyzer. That will be one of the biggest electrolyzer in the world for the time being in terms of green hydrogen production. The way I think we will be looking at people like Thabo to help us out is that we are talking gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity that is required. But currently, the biggest electrolyzer you'll find is around 100 megawatts. So this difference between where we are and where we want to get to is significant. And therefore, the collaboration with companies, technology companies, in terms of being able to scale up will be very important in terms of our ambitions, particularly from a Sasol to move from the fossil fuel base to green hydrogen. So it's going to be a significant uphill battle on both in terms of the ability to get the electrolyzer, the physical equipment, but also in terms of the cost, because this cost is significantly higher at this stage. Then that's the first project we're doing in Sasolburg, is repurposing an existing electrolyzer, and that production we expect that to come in 2023. Then the other project we're doing is in Secunda. In Secunda, what we're doing, we will be producing one of the first sustainable, synthetic sustainable aviation fuels. And this project, we're doing it with partners. As we have mentioned earlier, collaboration again is key, and all the projects Sasol is doing on green hydrogen are going to be done with partners. We're collaborating with banks, funding governments, and a number of other institutions, and we also in a number of consortiums that are really there to help us to scale up and de-risk these opportunities. So in Secunda, we'll be producing something like 50,000 tons of synthetic aviation fuel somewhere around the 2026. And the target for that, the synthetic fuel is to the airlines, because airlines are going to struggle to use hydrogen and battery as an alternative to the fossil fuel. So what they're looking for is an alternative for producing the current aviation fuel in a sustainable way. And as South Africa, between ourselves and Petro SA, we are leading in the Fischer-Tropsch technology and in production at scale. We are actually the biggest outside China in terms of the synthetic fuel production. And therefore, we actually, as a country, we have an opportunity not only to produce green hydrogen, but to add significant value to that green hydrogen. And that's why we're very optimistic in terms of our ability to compete with Chile, with Australia, in terms of the green hydrogen. Because at the end of the day, if we have to decarbonize at scale, green hydrogen needs to come down so low that it has to be somewhere in the region of about $1 to $1.50 compared to the current prices, which is about $5. The fossil maybe one point to highlight is that Sasol is currently one of the biggest globally producers of gray hydrogen, which is essentially one of the biggest producers of hydrogen. We produce about 2.5 million tons of gray hydrogen, but we use most of that for our own facilities. We sell a bit, some of it to some of our customers through a pipeline that runs from Sasolburg to Springs. But so in order that hydrogen, if we were to, as a country, if we look to export it as hydrogen, eventually it will be it's so difficult because of the competitive nature of it. It will be similar to what is happening with gas. You will have to add more value to it, and that's why we're very optimistic as a country and as a region that with the Fischer-Tropsch technology that we have, we need to capitalize on that. This is in addition to adding value to the PGMs that we have, that we can actually create a completely new industry at the back of green hydrogen, where we produce electrolyzer locally, we produce fuel cells locally, and when we add value through Fischer-Tropsch technologies and reindustrialize the country. And maybe just to underline the point that has been made earlier on around the just transition, and I think the biggest challenge we will have as a country, like if you look at Sasolburg and Secunda, they're all built on coal. We have transformed Sasolburg completely from coal to gas, but which means it's still a fossil fuel. So, and then in Secunda, it's very much about more than 90% coal. So if we were to talk about simple moving away from coal, that means the entire Secunda town would essentially collapse. And that means we need to find a better way to transition from the current coal dependency to a low carbon products. And unfortunately, I think the earlier point that was being discussed around Nigeria and other countries, if in South Africa, we don't have an opportunity to store, to capture the carbon and store it underground, which will allow us to continue to produce hydrogen from or electricity from these heavy emitters. So that means we have to find an alternative. That's why we're working with the Gauteng government, the Mpumalanga government, to define some of these opportunities where we can create a completely new industry. And part of it is really around the SEZ that we're now looking at in the Vaal Triangle, and also the work that we're doing with Anglo on the Hydrogen Valley, looking at how can we catalyze development of the new industries. So from a Sasol perspective, we're really driving a number of these catalytic projects, and we're looking for partners from both from the government and even international government collaboration, because some of the regulations are going across the border, as the Honorable Minister alluded to earlier on. So we need to be able to still continue to sell our products. We produce about 7 million tons of products from Secunda, and all that is from coal. So if we don't decarbonize, that product will have to find a new home because Europe and other regions will be closed. So it's really, from a Sasol perspective, it's an agent, but also we are very much excited about the opportunity to transition ourselves away from the greenhouse gas emitting challenges to a new hydrogen economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Fascinating. And the scale of what you're talking about is significant and great opportunity for us as a country. Maybe just staying with you briefly, Dumisani, your hydrogen ambitions, green hydrogen ambitions. I mean, a lot of what you talked about initially was internally driven, your own operations driven, trying to green your own operations. But the green hydrogen, is this something you're seeing as something that you're trying to supply in international markets, or is it but just mainly for your own operations?
Thank you for that question. It's one thing I missed. I concentrated on decarbonizing, but what the way we're approaching green hydrogen from a Sasol perspective, we're looking to decarbonize our operations, as I said, but we also see it as a great opportunity for Southern Africa to become a major hydrogen player, almost change the energy flows that we used to see with Middle East on oil and gas, to have the Southern Africa together competing with Chile and Australia, which are the other, and then the North Africa, which are the other regions that can produce hydrogen and green hydrogen derivative at relatively low cost. So we are leading, as you know, a project in Northern Cape called Bohobai, where we will be, it's one of the first lighthouse projects that South Africa is looking to develop green hydrogen at scale. And the initial target is to have a 4 gigawatt electrolyzer, which will require a 10 gigawatt renewable energy to support. And this project is currently on its, we started it last year, at the beginning of the year, and we have a feasibility that is going to run for the next 24 months. Transnet recently announced they're also looking to support these projects with development of the ports around the Northern Cape. So we actually, our view is that for us as South Africa to scale up fast, we'll have to initially start with the export opportunities particularly in the coastal area. The other reason why this is so important is that we don't have the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure to bring, because Northern Cape and the part of the Western Cape is where we have the best endowment and running into Namibia for renewables. So, and that's where we can produce green hydrogen at cost, because green hydrogen, 60% of that cost is renewables. So if you can get your renewables as low as possible, that means you can reduce your cost of hydrogen. But to pull that hydrogen, for instance, to Secunda or Sasolburg, it's going to take a long time. You'll have to put a grid infrastructure. Just to put the numbers into perspective, Secunda will require something like 20 gigawatt of electrolyzer, 50 gigawatt of renewable energy to decarbonize 100%. So to put that kind of infrastructure is going to take a long time, but that's why we believe that the export is going to allow us to scale up as South Africa and Southern Africa. So that I include Namibia, I include Mozambique, I include Zimbabwe, I include Zambia, to start with the export, because the export market can afford a relatively higher price, but also because of the grid system currently doesn't allow us to move the huge volumes of electricity that we're looking to move over time. So we absolutely looking at export. Unfortunately, it's a competition for South Africa, competing against Chile, competing against Australia, competing against the Middle East. So it's important for us as a region to put a comprehensive master plan that allows us to be very competitive against these regions. As the Honorable Deputy Ambassador said, some of the incentives that Zimbabwe is putting around renewable energy, they're quite important, and we're hoping that the regions are going to follow suit and put those incentives to encourage quicker scale up for export to be able to compete with other regions. Thank you.
Thank you. Exactly what I was looking to hear. So thank you for that. Sierra, you mentioned your participation in the Energy Council. I'm aware that it's reasonably new, I guess, and still finding your way in some ways. From your own operations point of view, clearly the 100 megawatt cap was a big move, a big change to enable what you would like to achieve. Just a couple of questions. The Energy Council, are there like one or two other major levers like that cap that you are now targeting? And just inquisitively, are there any regional discussions within the Energy Council, any dependencies that you're looking to the region for as an Energy Council of South Africa that we should be aware of?
Okay. Peter, it's interesting, the conversation or the challenge that was put up by Marius from Gibbs to say we could be Highness or we could be the African Limes. And I think the discussion that we are having now is demonstrating why what companies that would otherwise be seen as competitors are actually in the Energy Council to unlock the hydrogen economy of South Africa and compete. And 8-9 years ago, when we met with the different ministers to ask them, allow us to test the technologies. We are speaking of electrolyzers here. We have the biggest electrolyzer in Africa sitting in Mogalakwena, because we are just not trying to bring other people's technologies and set them up. We want to produce our own in South Africa, and the only way we could do that is to have pilots. So what we have in Mogalakwena is actually a pilot to produce green hydrogen, harness it, store it. So we are looking at storage as well, store it, and use it as a catalytic factor to basically transmit the renewables. He's speaking of a grid We are speaking of what I call, it's my own way of explaining it, that it's almost like an artificial grid, because out of our 18 sites in South Africa, we are putting in and out of our sites this mini grids, mini grids, mini grids, and through what we are able to generate, we are going to put it back into the grid. We are working with Andre and Eskom also on the pumped up hydro storage. So when we spoke to the ministers years ago, this is 8, 9 years ago, to say, allow us to bring these technologies, because they do two things. They grow our footprint in terms of being among the first movers in terms of hydrogen in the world. But they also allow us to address the issues of skills, because automatically what happens is, as soon as you start having these pilot centers in South Africa, and this could be at Sasol, this could be with us or Siemens Energy, the people that you attract and the people that you have, they start realizing they have to start adapting and getting new skills. And I remember how proud the president was when he drove a 510-ton fully laden truck. This is massive. This is bigger than where we are. This is massive by any standards. And the president was in the truck with this gentleman who used to be just a truck driver, one of our haulage truck drivers, and did not have the skills. I'm just giving an example of the skills that we have seen change as a result of this conversation, the skills that we have to work on to change. So I think that the Energy Council plays a very important role, and I think we all recognize that where we say, usually we would be competitors, but on the green hydrogen, we definitely are not competitors. We have to work together. We have to share what technologies we are working on so that we compete against Chile, we compete against Peru, we compete against Australia. And thank God, at the time I was involved in these discussions and negotiations with the different ministers to say, and the presidency, to say, please create an enabling environment. You are, at this current moment, we and you are on the same side. We are South Africa Inc. Champions for hydrogen. Remove all these barriers. Because at the time we didn't know why we have. Remove these barriers, bring them down. Because this is how much we have to put out in gigawatts for us to, even ourselves, to just displace diesel. Because we are not displacing gas at the mines, we are displacing diesel. Just for us to be able to do that, we need to apply, at that time I think the cap was 10 megawatts, and it went up to 50 megawatts. And we said, please change this, remove these barriers, and then you will allow the private sector to run with what the private sector knows how to do, which is become innovative in terms of technologies, become innovative in terms of financing solutions, and attract more investment. And yes, you are right. We welcomed, as a council, as a company, we welcome the relaxation, that the announcements that came from the president. And on a regional basis, we have not yet discussed this at the Energy Council level, but I can tell you that as Anglo, this is of interest to us. We have mines in the Great Dyke in Zimbabwe. The place is like the Bushveld, is rich in PGMs, and we have good mines there. I know that Impala also has good mines in that area, and I was very happy listening to Deputy Ambassador Sibande talk about what Zimbabwe wants to do. So yes, on a regional basis, we have to start thinking about wheeling. We need to think about storage as well. And definitely at the right time, we would be approaching those governments. And yes, I don't sit in the NBF for nothing. I think these platforms, including the Energy Council and others, would come handy for us to have those conversations.
Thanks, Sierra. Thabo, just finishing with you, technology is so key to this conversation. Just your perspectives on the level of maturity, I guess, within your customers, your clients, on getting this technology, understanding this technology. I know certainly in the work we've done in the gas space, a big part of of that discussion was sitting with the ministries, sitting with the decision makers, explaining to them how our gas economy would develop. Just your views on emerging technology and what needs to be done at a regional level?
Sure. I wanted to sketch a picture first around just to tie in the conversation of what's possible. If you look at SADC in specific, and you look at all the technologies required for to fully decarbonize, you've got the DRC, you've got the PGMs, South Africa, Zimbabwe. So you can have cobalt, you can have vanadium, you can have iridium, you can have platinum, which goes into the electrolyzers. We're so well endowed as a region that we should be actually having an internal conversation on how do we leverage and link up with the technology conversation. Because as Siemens Energy, when we say we want to develop green hydrogen or these electrolyzers to gigawatt scale, the next question that comes is when you're going to get your inputs. Did you secure your supply chain to such an extent that there's less disruptions and so on? So it then leads us to a conversation which is obvious, which is that 75% of the PGMs, you'll find them here. Now I sit and wonder, okay, so why are we not leveraging that conversation? Yes, I know we've linking up, but I just want to share a little bit just to paint a picture around that. It does not have to be made in Berlin. The materials are here. It's the same as a conversation with the DRC. They are asking, why does it have to be in China? And I think that's kind of the conversations that we need to use some of these energy councils and so on to elevate the conversation and the government and technology players to try and link up some of those, because some of those supply chains are not locked yet. Unlike trying to displace a solar panel manufacturer who's already got, he's already got a well set up, the technology there, the skill sets and so forth. So these ones are not. But to your point, also on technology, I think we're pretty surprised around, from a user perspective, the level of knowledge that they already have about technologies. So we talk about in the electrolyzer, we talk about PAM, batteries, we'll talk about lithium, but there's vanadium that sits in the pot. Then you have to answer questions around the alkaline electrolyzers and so on. So I think the level of maturity from a user perspective is actually quite high. Where sometimes we find the gap is when we get to the policymakers, that we often have to engage in study tours to try and make sure that we all have the same level of understanding before the policy gets issued out. And that's something that we sometimes tend to forget. There's a study tour that happened last week. The German government got involved, took a couple of people in the green hydrogen space from Namibia and South Africa. They spend about a week going to various industries to kind of have a look on use cases, production levels, technology complexities and setups and so on. And then when you come back, actually there was a gentleman who was saying, when you come back, you then are able to conceptualize, in fact, move beyond conceptual to what actually is required for me to either start the pilots and scale up my production. So I think that's the missing link that I see that we need to strengthen quite a bit more.
Excellent. I think just a very big thank you to our speakers. Fascinating the stories that we've heard from the three of you, and we know that there's so many more of these same stories out there. So thank you very much for your time, for your contribution. I think a round of applause from all of us to yourselves. And we'll continue with the program. Feel free to relax on the other side. We will try to wrap up quite quickly now at the last few sessions. So on the regional view, I hand over from myself to myself to discuss this very briefly. So I think from our side, just to share with you that SADC Secretariat were very keen to be here today with us. They've been a big supporter of these events in the past, and have, as you will be aware, just before COVID, the last one was on transmission. During COVID, we did some stuff in digital transition, and they've been very supportive and see how we can support their strategies in this space. So I think for the purposes of today, the only thing I think we need to be aware of is that as the NBF, what we look for in the work that we do is there political will? Because our mandate is to support government-endorsed initiatives by mobilizing private sector resources. So fundamentally what that means is political will is so important. So we must work on things that governments themselves see as priorities, but important where there's a strong overlay with the interests of business. So our first test in this case is, what is SADC themselves doing? So you may or may not be aware that there is a SADC Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, 2020-2030. Important, it's got a number of pillars, but important to note that within that, environment and climate change is one of their key cross-cutting issues. If you dig a little bit deeper, you get into some of the strategic objectives around climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So these are named things, with key outcomes on enhanced sector-based approaches towards developing climate change resilience. And important, the Minister mentioned it earlier, the SADC Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. So that is a formal document that they have put in place. And outcome 2 being the reduced carbon footprint in the region. And this is one that we haven't mentioned today, but there's also a SADC Regional Green Economy Strategy and Action Plan. So as part of their RISDIP, they're looking to execute against these documents. I won't go into the detail of the documents now. I don't think we have sufficient time to really do it justice, but the Minister did allude to it earlier. They're based on sectors, where there are specific plans being put in place around sectors, and there's the opportunity to see how we can support them. Taking it back to the NEPAD Business Foundation, I just looked at a couple of those sectors and see how we do already work. We ourselves as an organization have taken a strategic shift in the last year to focus on the big issues that are global big issues. So you'll see it up there, but we're focusing on trade facilitation, climate change, digital transition. These are the big global issues at the moment. If you dig into what the SADC strategies talk about, they talk about water. It was very well mentioned by Mike and Nedbank, the importance of water going forward. We have got strong programs around water resilience, working with municipalities on non-revenue water, on improving water efficiency, on improving billing. So there's a huge opportunity to scale that and leverage that in South Africa and in the region. Then you go into the transport and infrastructure space. So again, our existing initiatives focus a lot on road to rail transition. So whilst it's a trade enabler, is where we first started working into it, it's also very aligned to the climate change. So we continue to focus on road to rail, and particularly decarbonizing in the transport space. As it relates to energy, again, our thinking was endorsed today in a lot of what we've said. The central theme being that SADC as a region, its biggest carbon contributor is South Africa. So the big conversation is around how do you help South Africa to reach its carbon targets, and our focus within that is to say, what are the regional dependencies on South Africa reaching its carbon targets? So we've heard about regional gas, the importance of regional gas, and what is its role in the transition, the importance of regional generation projects, the importance of regional transmission projects. These are all parts of the South African ILP, and again, a strong focus. And then we've had the discussion now about new tech, the importance of green hydrogen, battery value chains. So I guess these are areas that we'd want to scale up our work. Amongst other things, there's stuff, tourism, we're doing work, waste recycling, also doing work. So I do think at a future session, there will be an opportunity to engage SADC Secretariat more directly. I would hazard to suggest that the engagement in getting these strategies in place with business at large has probably been limited, but there is an opportunity to harness that, to figure out how we can support and drive that agenda going forward. So that really is all I wanted to share with you from the SADC perspective. Before inviting Professor Busani Nkweni, Professor, I'm not sure, did you have a presentation or? Yes. The professor is the Director General and Principal of the National School of Government. Just going to respond to what we've heard so far. Thank you very much, Professor.
Ambassador, Minister, and all the colleagues who are here, and thank you for inviting us here. Well, it's supposed to almost aggregate some of the conversations that have been taking place here, and I think the people who have been presenting here have been very clear. Safe to say that there's few things maybe to emphasize, starting with what the chairman of Nedbank said, which is very crucial for us in the public sector, as well as what I want to pose to all of you as a challenge to what we need to do. And that the chairman said, just transition is not just about electricity, but it's about the entire energy value chain. I hope, Mr. Chairman, I am quoting you correctly. Now, if you use that as a starting point of what we need to do, especially to deal or build dynamic capabilities within the public sector, all we have to do is to imagine that all mayors of all municipalities in South Africa, metro, district, local, were here in this room, and they were processing all this content that has been shared this evening. And the following day, this mayor needs to chair a council meeting where they must make a decision because the municipal manager or any other senior official has brought a proposal saying this is what SASOL wants to do in an operation located in our municipality. And the implications of us approving that which SASOL or any other firm wants to do here is that we might lose jobs or we might create value. You are a chair of council. We don't need to belabor the point that to be a mayor, a minister, or any other elected public servant, all you need is political capital. That's all. Well, they did introduce in the ruling party issues of CVs recently, and they wanted degrees and so on. But we know that that's the reality across the world, right? Now, the question then becomes, how do we ensure that the colleagues, especially in the last panel, and many others who were speaking this evening, that from that presentation by the mayor, supported by or any other executive head, in that meeting will come out of a council meeting with a positive decision. And that in the type of conversations taking place inside council, more so now as we've moved into the era of coalitions, that is not just a straightforward discussion where there will have been a caucus somewhere of a majority party, they move in, they agree, they might even be looking at whether there's any BE benefits and things like those, and the decision goes quicker. Because there's diversity in the room, there's people from various political parties, you know that it's likely to be a contested decision. In the end, it might be made positive or negative. And therefore, the challenge is, now that we have identified the problem statement, that there's a challenge of climate change, and everybody agrees on that, and there's even broader consensus on what then we will call what needs to be addressed, and this is the issue of the just transition. I think there's broad consensus on that. The challenge, however, is then the solution to it. Most of the contest taking place either politically, ideologically, and otherwise is around the solution, not about whether or not we must address issues of climate change, which is then the challenge for all the executives and decision makers who are here. That's using my example of a mayor who leads a small or big municipality. We can use an example of a live example of a municipality in Northwest where Clover had to shut down. Why? Because of the first and foremost, the quality of decisions made by people in leadership, which could be in a local, province, or national department, followed by the quality of skills and capabilities available in that institution, which could be at a local, province, and national level. And therefore, my challenge to all of us, having listened to all of this, is that what we need to do is to use this metaphor that on complex matters like these ones of the just transition, the state, including other non-state actors, are like a 1-ton truck carrying a 10-ton load. You will be as frustrated as you are for a very long period unless we make a strategic decision that as private sector in particular, we are going to invest in strengthening the ability of a 1-ton truck to carry a 10-ton load. Because it is a reality for officials, elected or appointed, that they must worry about jobs and many other things that people are debating when we talk about the just transition. So we are a 1-ton truck carrying a 10 to 100-ton load. Our collective responsibility is to build dynamic capabilities of people to make and improve the quality of decisions they make, the speed with which they make those quality decisions, as well as the evidence behind the decisions that they make. And you do that by building dynamic capabilities. Those who are in transport or engineers will tell you may have to change the tires. Of course, there are threats in the system everywhere, so you must change and put new tires. You may have to change the springs, the suspension, you must augment. And in fact, you may have to do something in the engine as well. And all of this is what we call as the National School of Government, building dynamic capabilities. So it is only if we retain public servants, elected and appointed, into a simulator and empower them with the type of skills and capabilities that enable them to make those quality decisions that we can begin to see a difference. Because in many instances, in fact, even some of you who are experts who are here today, even those of you who are engineers, you never learned at school what we're talking about here. You didn't. This is new. So to be fair, yourself will have to invest hours and hours and days immersing yourself into this conversation to a point where you can come today and sit before this esteemed audience to capably make the kind of argument that we are making. We need to do the same with public servants. We need to do the same with politicians, because there are many people who might have 4 PhDs in engineering who may not be able to engage in a conversation we're talking about here, because the reality is that some of these things are new. So we are making that challenge as the National School of Government, that we've got the power to convene. We already see private sector investing in some of the work that we do. Because we've got power to convene, it means we can provide training solutions to everybody. Even the president is actually our student. And we told him, if you don't do that yourself, you may not have sufficient time to attend conferences, read books, watch documentaries, meet people. But if you come to the space that we are working on, you will be able to broaden your understanding of what's happening globally, locally, as well as in the continent. And I mean, we're very happy, Mr. Chair and CEO, that Nedbank is amongst those institutions that are leading. Anglo-American is doing the same, as well as others. This is very key, because to build these dynamic capabilities, it requires collaboration. We can convene all ministers of energy or mining across the SADC region or across the continent and put a summer school together so that they have a similar appreciation. The chair of Nedbank will tell you the type of conversation he was having with some of the ministers from the African on this. In fact, people argue that the banks, or the suspicion, that the banks are in cahoots with people who are selling technology, and that you are now determining energy policy by saying what you will fund and what you will not fund. In some instances, those type of conclusions are based on the limited information that people have. And so the argument we are making is, let's break the information barrier. Let's build these dynamic capabilities across the levels, because even Minister Chrissy herself, the official that she works with, fortunately, is a highly technical department, but those are the people who have to provide this type of briefs, as much as it is the case anywhere else in the world. So this is a proposal that we wish to make. Let's spare no effort in building dynamic capabilities across the public sector to improve the quality of decisions that people make. Those decisions must be evidence, based, and they must know that even when business say this is the direction we might be taking, business makes those decisions on the basis of their interest and the interest of the country. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for helping with that decision. So in the interest of time, we do not want to drag this out all night, so we hopefully will finish quite close to what we'd set out to do. We had a session for discussions. We're going to park that. I know that there's lots of organizations here that have got lots to share. We'll have to think about how we can get that in another session. You've seen the speakers. Please engage with them afterwards if there's any direct questions you'd like to ask for them. So we're going to skip the discussions, and apologies for that. But I think your families will be appreciative of that. Two things left, so we're going to go to a wrap and closure. So my colleague Kudzanai Banguri, who's our program manager for the infrastructure work, will help us with that, and then we'll hand over to Geoff for a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, I have the unenviable task of being the one who's standing between you and your dinner and your drinks and your networking, so I'll be brief. My task is simple. It is just to give a wrap-up and closing remarks in terms of what we have discussed and deliberated on today. We started off with some really good insights that came from the Nedbank CEO, Mike Brown. He started us off on discussions around capital, citing specifics as an example that the material capital that is required is around 250 billion over a 30-year period. Chairman Mpho Makwana then took us through the journey of reflecting on the physical impacts, as Honorable Minister Barbara Creecy put it, the physical impacts that are tangibly affecting our region. And he gave us some good examples. 36% of all weather-related disasters registered by the 16 SADC member states. Lesotho, Botswana, Malawi, the floods that we've seen in Mozambique, all these things we have all seen. And he did challenge us as well that perhaps we also need to draw some wisdom from the baobab tree. And I think the quotes that he gave us there were some really good pearls of wisdom. We then moved on into some discussions around the fundamentals in the science. And Honorable Minister Barbara Creecy and Her Excellency Deputy Ambassador Sibanda also assisted us in terms of reflecting on the science. So we already are at that 1 degree Celsius, and we can't move further to go to 1.5. This is the challenge and the task that we have. Minister Creecy also helped us reflect on just the realities that at this current stage, customers are increasingly putting pressure on suppliers to green their products, to green their supply chains. And as the SASOL colleagues were reflecting on, there will be no market in Europe if you have not greened your products. We then moved on into the discussion with the academic cluster and the financiers as well. And they just assisted us to reflect on issues such as the mitigating, how to mitigate the impacts of failed transitions, reflecting on the energy mix itself going to 2050, the fact that you will have renewables increasing in terms of that energy mix, nuclear following suit, and then coal being the trailing commodity and resource. And then we moved into the final discussion where we had Catherine Kaufman and our Bosman and Dr. Oosthuizen, where they reflected on some really interesting elements such as the taxonomy agenda, defining the green hydrogen corridors, the role of DFIs in terms of investing in new and innovative technologies, which I think is a critical element. Innovation is where the growth will come. And then there were some really good provocative questions that were posed by Dr. Martin Davis around what do the fossil fuel dependent countries on our continent do, where, as he put it, oil is the only game in town? What do they do from an industrialization perspective? And I think Dr. Eustazen gave some really good remarks around how that transition could be handled. And there were some interesting comments as well from Catherine as an example. Localization should not be a swear word. It really should be, we should be thinking about it as being that element that gives us the license to operate. And then we closed off with a really good discussion from the private sector. And I've just circled here in bold that the summary of it was green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is really where that focus needs to be in terms of how companies can collaborate, how they can put their minds together, put their technologies together. But beyond just the collaboration, looking at the entire supply chain, sourcing of what is required from the PGM's perspective, etc. And there were some interesting elements as well that we picked up and that were posed by Sasol as an example in terms of scale, that we really are starting to talk about moving from megawatt capacity to gigawatt capacity in terms of electrolyzers. And that's a massive jump, but this is the kind of aspiration that we really should be looking to. So they touched a lot about some of the projects they're doing: synthetic aviation fuel, hydrogen fuel cell trucks from the Anglo perspective, hydrogen-ready gas turbines, and the competition that's required between all these companies. And then we concluded, of course, with the regional views from what SADC is doing within the region. And then the metaphor, which I quite liked, which was the final comment around the 1-ton truck carrying a 10-ton load. And I think that really sums up the discussions that we had, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a long road ahead. But the opportunity, as the Deputy Ambassador from Zimbabwe indicated, the opportunity is massive. And it's there for us to take. So with that, and without keeping you further from going back to your families, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kudzi. It was really good. Thanks for sharing that. Geoff, the final word over to you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to say a very, very big thank you. I'm not going to go through who's here, who's not here. But firstly, Nedbank, thank you for your wonderful support. The fact that the Chairman and the CEO have sat through and are still with us is commendable. The speakers were fantastic. The thought provocation is great. From our point of view as the NEPAD Business Foundation, there's a lot to think about and a lot to do. But I think the information shared today just opens our mind to the extent of the problem, and that the problem is now. It's not tomorrow and it's not somebody else's. In fact, every one of us is involved, and not only are we involved, but we need to be doing something about it, and we need to have a better understanding. And I think, climate change is spoken about out there, but nobody really fully understands what it means unless they've had some sort of incident that's affected them. And that's the same at many things in life. But from my point of view, to the teams that have helped us to put this together, the NEPAD side, thank you very much indeed. Our staff, fantastic. Peter and Kutsi, really appreciate what's been put in. But to all of you, let's continue to engage, but more importantly, let's continue to act. And thank you and have a good evening.